Everyone knows Peter Griffin works at the Pawtucket Brewery. It's the job fans picture first, but the brewery was his third major job. Before it came a toy factory, a fishing boat, and a towel boy gig that started everything. And those are just the permanent ones. In this video, we break down every job Peter Griffin has ever had. The Towel Boy 1. Family Guy premiered on January 31, 1999 on the Fox network, immediately following Super Bowl 33. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old when it aired. He had been building the idea for years before that, starting with a short animated film he made as his thesis project at the Rhode Island School of Design in 1995, called The Life of Larry. That film led to a follow-up called Larry and Steve, which caught the attention of Fox executives. They gave MacFarlane roughly $40,000 to develop a pilot, and he came back with something that impressed them enough to order a full series. The show that resulted was set in a fictional Rhode Island town called Quahog, and it followed a working-class family: Peter, Lois, their 3 children, and a talking dog named Brian. MacFarlane was the youngest person to create and executive produce a prime-time series in television history at the time. He also wrote the show, voiced 4 of its main characters, and helped animate the original pitch material himself. The production scale was modest. The ambitions were not. Rhode Island is a small state with a wide social spectrum, and the writers understood that from the start. Quahog, the fictional city where the Griffins live, sits at one end of that spectrum. Newport, a real coastal city in Rhode Island, sits at the other. Quahog is Middle America compressed into a New England frame. Neighborhood bars, modest houses on modest streets, people working jobs that pay ordinary wages, living lives that look a lot like the majority of American lives. Newport has always been something different. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, it served as a summer gathering point for the American wealthy class. Enormous coastal properties were built there by families whose fortunes came from railroads and industry, and those properties were famously called cottages by their owners, despite many of them being the size of small hotels. The gap between Quahog and Newport, between those two versions of what Rhode Island is the gap that Peter Griffin has spent the entire series straddling without quite knowing how he got there. Seth MacFarlane built Peter to be a man full of contradictions that probably should not coexist in one person, but somehow do. He is impulsive and kind-hearted in ways that often arrive at the same moment. He is deeply ignorant about most subjects, and occasionally insightful in ways he cannot reproduce or explain. He is physically reckless in ways that should have ended his life many times over, and yet the show has never once let him stay dead for long. He is also, against every rational expectation, married to a woman whose family is among the wealthiest in Rhode Island. That marriage is the engine behind more Family Guy storylines than any other single fact about the show's setup, and the entire thing traces back to a job Peter held when he was 18 years old. Long before Quahog became the frame for his life, long before Mr. Weed and his toy factory, long before the fishing boat, the brewery, and every other chapter of his working life that followed. All of that came later. The resume begins with a stack of towels at a private club in Newport. Newport Country Club, as Family Guy presents it, is the kind of place that functions by making the separation between insiders and outsiders visible at all times. The club is expensive, private, and organized around the comfort of people for whom expense and privacy are ordinary features of daily life. The Pewterschmidt family belongs there. They have always belonged there. The club is their natural environment, in the same way that a neighborhood bar in Quahog is natural for Peter and his friends. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, is one of the show's most consistent characters, precisely because his relationship to money and status is so clearly defined. He is loud about what he has, contemptuous toward anyone he considers beneath him, and deeply invested in keeping the social categories he moves between clean and visible. He married into the Pewterschmidt fortune and spent a lifetime adding to it. His sense of himself is inseparable from his sense of his own position. The Newport Country Club is not somewhere Carter goes to relax. It is somewhere he goes to be Carter Pewterschmidt, which for him amounts to exactly the same thing. Marguerite Pewterschmidt, Lois's aunt, was the specific family member who created the circumstance that changed everything. She needed someone to work as a towel boy at the club. The position called for a young man to handle the practical details of the facility, keep supplies stocked and distributed, stay out of sight, and perform a function the members needed without drawing any attention to himself. Peter was 18. He needed money. By the operational logic of Newport Country Club, he was precisely what the job required. A young man from outside the club's social world, hired to do something useful and otherwise remain invisible. He showed up. He did the job. He handed out towels and stayed out of the way that the position required. And at some point during his time working for Marguerite, he made the kind of eye contact with Lois Pewterschmidt that the Newport Country Club was not in any way designed to allow. Lois was not supposed to notice the towel boy. Carter Pewterschmidt's project as a father was to steer his daughter towards someone suitable, someone from a family with real standing, someone whose background aligned with the Pewterschmidt world. Newport Country Club was exactly the kind of environment where that steering was supposed to happen naturally, because everyone present was, by definition, someone Carter could picture his daughter building a life with. Everyone except the teenager from Quahog handing out towels near the pool. What followed became the central premise of the entire show. Lois chose Peter over every more rational option her background made available. She chose him over Carter's objections, which were loud from the beginning and never really stopped. She chose him over Glenn Quagmire, who was also pursuing her during that period, and who had, by most observable measures, considerably more to offer. She chose the towel boy, and Family Guy has been generating storylines from the energy of that choice across more than 25 seasons. Carter's contempt for Peter is one of the show's most reliable engines. His disdain takes different shapes in different episodes, but always connects back to the same original judgment. His daughter married someone who once handed her family towels for a living, and that fact sits with Carter the way something unpleasant settles into a room. The contempt is played for comedy, but it is specific enough to feel rooted in something real. Carter does not hold a vague philosophical objection to working-class people as a category. His objection is personal and pointed. This specific man, from this specific background, with this specific absence of social standing, ended up in his family through a side door that Carter never intended to leave open. He made his feelings clear when Peter first appeared at the club, and every episode that puts the two of them in the same room has carried that original dynamic forward ever since. The show referenced the towel boy backstory directly in the second season episode Peter Caviar Eater. While the Griffin household collides with the Pewterschmidt world during an episode centered on Lois inheriting property from her family, Lois reminds Aunt Marguerite that the man now her husband is the same young man who once worked as Marguerite's towel boy at the club. The callback passes quickly, played for discomfort as much as laughs. But it confirms that the writers treated the towel boy job as the origin point for everything about Peter's relationship to that world. He was first encountered there as labor, and no amount of marriage or family connection has ever fully changed the framing. Meet the Quagmires, a fifth-season episode built around Peter and Brian traveling back in time to the 1980s, fills in more of the picture. The audience watches young Peter navigating the early stages of his relationship with young Lois, while Carter actively tries to redirect her and Quagmire competes for her attention. The Newport world runs through those scenes as constant background, quietly clarifying the distance between what Peter is and what Carter wanted for his daughter. Peter's persistence through that period, against Carter's hostility, and despite having nothing obvious to offer by that world's standards, is what made the marriage happen. One detail folded into the show's broader mythology adds another layer worth noting. Cleveland Brown, who would become one of Peter's closest friends in Quahog, also worked as a towboy at Newport Country Club in 1984. Two men who would spend years together at the Drunken Clam, watching football and drinking cheap beer, both passed through that exclusive club doing the same low-paying service job. Family Guy drops this without making an event of it, but it places both of them in the same unexpected location, operating in a world that was built to exclude people like them, long before Quahog became the whole frame of their lives. Peter's path to that towel boy position starts in circumstances that explain a lot about who he is. He was born in Mexico, with his mother Thelma traveling at the time of his birth, and was raised in Quahog by his adoptive father, Francis Griffin. His biological father, an Irishman named Mickey McFinnigan, was absent from his childhood and did not become part of his life until much later. Francis Griffin was the man who raised him, and Francis left a specific kind of mark. Francis Griffin was a devoutly Catholic, deeply rigid man who organized his life around work and religious observance, and who had little patience for weakness or deviation from his standards. The show uses Francis as a comic figure, but the portrait it builds of him across multiple episodes is also genuinely specific. He worked at the Pawtucket Mill before being forced to retire, and his work ethic was so absolute that he considered taking a lunch break a sin. He refused to accept Peter's marriage to Lois because she was Protestant rather than Catholic, and his contempt for her ran so deep that he referred to her in ways the show cannot repeat at a family dinner. The Pope himself once tried to soften Francis's stance on Peter's interfaith marriage, and Francis responded by concluding that even the Pope had gone soft. His relationship with Peter was demanding and frequently cold, in ways that the show treats as both comedy and, quietly, as something more complicated. Growing up in that household gave Peter a particular shape, a deep desire to be liked, alongside a spectacular inability to follow basic instructions. A genuine loyalty to the people he loves, alongside a capacity for casual selfishness, and a stubborn confidence in himself that has almost no rational foundation, but has never once gone away. Getting that towel boy job at Newport Country Club placed Peter inside a world his background gave him no preparation for. From close range, he could observe how people with real money organized their days, what they expected from the people around them, how they spoke and carried themselves. He was not one of them, and was not going to become one. But the geography of the position put him close enough to see it. And the most significant thing he found in that proximity was not a lesson about wealth or class. It was Lois. Family Guy has always been a show about class, even when the comedy is pointed somewhere else. The Quahog that Peter lives in is working class by design. He and his friends, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire, are men who earn what they have. They drink at a neighborhood bar. They worry about money the way ordinary people worry about money. The Griffin house at 31 Spooner Street is not comfortable in any lavish sense. Peter works because the household needs him to. None of that looks anything like the Newport Country Club. Every gathering that puts Carter and Peter in the same room carries the original Newport dynamic running underneath it. The wealthy father-in-law has never stopped seeing his son-in-law through the lens of that first contact at the club. Peter has never entirely stopped behaving in ways that confirm Carter's judgment. The two of them circle each other across decades of family occasions and shared disasters. And underneath all of it is the same original fact. A towel boy from Quahog ended up inside the Pewterschmidt family through a door Carter never intended to leave unlocked. Jobs define people in ways that go beyond whatever paycheck they produce. The towel boy position at Newport Country Club was not a defining job in the sense of being a career or a calling, or something Peter was especially suited for. He needed money at 18. He found work. By every normal measure, it was the most forgettable job he ever held. But it put him in the right place at the right moment, and the thing he found there has shaped more of his life than any other job on his resume ever came close to. Every career starts somewhere. Some starting points are obvious, and some are accidental. And some arrive because a person needed income at a particular moment in their life. Peter Griffin started with a stack of towels at a country club in Newport, Rhode Island, held by a young man from Quahog, with no idea that the most important thing he was about to do at that job had nothing to do with towels. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The towel boy job at Newport Country Club gave Peter the marriage, the class divide, and the father-in-law problem that have followed him for the rest of his life. Next, Peter gets his first full-time job, holds it for 3 seasons, and manages to make children across the country genuinely afraid of toys. Section 2. The Safety Inspector. The happy-go-lucky toy factory sits in the first frame of Peter Griffin's working life the way a pilot episode sits in the first frame of a television series, establishing the tone, setting the stakes, and making absolutely clear what kind of story is about to be told. Peter worked there as a safety inspector from the very first episode of Family Guy onward. His job was to check the toys coming off the assembly line and confirm they were safe before they went out into the world for children to play with. He was, in other words, the last line of defense between a toy company and the children its products were supposed to reach. That context matters, because the first thing Peter did in that job, in the very first episode of the show, was fall asleep at the switch and let through some of the most dangerous objects ever boxed and shipped to children in the history of fictional consumer products. The pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow, establishes the pattern with no delay. Peter attends a friend's bachelor party the night before a workday, promises Lois he will not drink, breaks that promise almost the moment he arrives, and wakes up the next morning barely functional. He goes to the toy factory in that state, sits down at his inspection station, and falls asleep. What follows him down the conveyor belt and into boxes destined for stores and children's bedrooms includes a butcher knife, razor blades, a porcupine, a surge protector, a gasoline can, and a toaster already loaded with forks inside. These toys go out. Children across the country are hurt. The company receives press coverage that would be catastrophic for any real business, and Mr. Weed fires Peter on the spot. Jonathan Weed was Peter's boss for the full duration of his time at the factory. The character is one of Family Guy's early recurring supporting figures, a strange and specific creation. The owner and manager of a business called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, which he had run for most of its 23-year history. The show hinted repeatedly at aspects of Mr. Weed's private life without ever stating them plainly. A recurring gag placed him in situations with male employees that carried a particular charge. In one episode, Peter walks into a locker room and reports finding Mr. Weed in a compromising position with a softball ringer the boss had hired for the company team. In another, Peter invents a product called Mr. Zucchini Head that resembles something other than a toy, and Mr. Weed takes it into his office and does not come back out with it. The show never put a label on any of this. It simply kept returning to the same joke from different angles across 3 seasons and let the audience fill in the blanks. Beyond those running gags, Mr. Weed was a grounded supporting character whose primary function was to give Peter's working life a specific shape. Someone to answer to, someone to repeatedly disappoint, someone who kept hiring him back despite every rational reason not to. Filing a disability claim was how Peter recovered his job after the pilot episode firing. The show does not dwell long on the mechanics. Peter is fired, Peter loses the job, and then Peter is employed again because he located a legal mechanism that restored his position. This is the first instance of what became a recurring pattern throughout his years at the factory. Peter does something catastrophic, faces real consequences, and then finds a way through them that has nothing to do with having grown or changed as a person. He was fired from the happy-go-lucky toy factory 3 times across his time there, and faced the threat of termination 3 more times beyond that. He survived every single one. The toy factory was where Peter kept landing regardless of how many reasons it had to stop letting him back in. His time at the factory stretched across more than just the safety inspection disasters. In the second season episode, I Am Peter, Hear Me Roar, Peter tells a sexist joke at work that every male coworker finds amusing, until a female coworker named Sarah Bennett files a sexual harassment lawsuit. The factory faces potential shutdown, and Mr. Weed's options narrow quickly. Fire Peter or send him to a sensitivity program. He chooses the program. Peter attends, and the experience transforms him in ways that nobody around him wanted or anticipated. He comes home with a dramatically altered personality, speaking softly, taking up space in front of the mirror, and attempting to breastfeed Stewie. Lois and his friends approach the edge of their patience with the new version before things eventually correct themselves. The episode is one of the earliest examples of the toy factory as the origin point for consequences that ripple outward through every other part of Peter's life. Throughout those first 3 seasons, the factory provides a daily structure to Peter's existence that the show uses and then periodically blows up. He shows up, something goes wrong, he survives it. The products the happy-go-lucky toy factory put into the world during this period are a catalog of inspired chaos. Among them is G.I. Joe, a military action figure with a cultural specificity that the show presents without much commentary. There is the Silly Ball. There are Pound Poochies, a product whose cheerful name stood in sharp contrast to the cyanide pills that ended up inside the boxes during the Dangerous Toys incident in the pilot. Mr. Zucchini Head, Baby Heimlich, which sounds educational and probably was not. The toy factory's product line across these seasons was never fully under control, which is fitting given who was responsible for making sure it was safe. The episode, Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington, from the 3rd season, represents one of the stranger chapters in Peter's time at the factory. The happy-go-lucky toy factory is bought out by the El Dorado Cigarette Company, a tobacco corporation seeking to improve its public image by acquiring a business associated with children. The new corporate ownership makes a calculation about Peter that is both logical and badly miscalculated. He is exactly the kind of man who might be genuinely convincing to a congressional committee if pointed at the right target. They promote him to company president and dispatch him to Washington to lobby against a bill that would restrict the tobacco industry. Peter, as company president, receives access to all the perks that title provides. He accepts them without hesitation and begins conducting himself the way he typically conducts himself when given authority he does not understand, which is enthusiastically and without a working sense of where the limits are. Washington receives him well enough at the start. The lobbyist role suits Peter in the same way that any job suits him, when the job does not yet require him to do anything difficult. He attends the dinners. He has the meetings. He carries the sense of importance that comes with being the man a corporation sent to influence federal lawmakers. Lois watches all of it and sees the manipulation clearly before Peter does. She understands that the El Dorado Cigarette Company is using her husband's genuine enthusiasm as a vehicle for their own interests, and that Peter has no framework for recognizing what that looks like from the inside. The change arrives quietly. Peter is about to address Congress with prepared remarks that would advocate for the tobacco company's position, when he hears Stewie coughing somewhere nearby. The association between tobacco and children is one that Peter manages to make in the moment, in real time, before the speech is delivered. He abandons what the El Dorado Cigarette Company sent him to say and does something honest instead. The company does not get what it paid for. Peter returns to being a regular employee of the factory rather than its president, and the whole episode closes as a brief preview of a pattern that would repeat many times across the show's history. Peter getting access to power he did not earn, wielding it chaotically, and then having it taken away before the damage becomes permanent. A detail folded into the show's continuity creates one of the funnier timeline problems in the series. The third season episode, One If by Clam, Two If by Sea, reveals that Peter had been working at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory since 1977. Given what the show establishes about Peter's age elsewhere, that start date would have made him approximately 11 years old when he took the job. The show makes no attempt to resolve this. The year sits in the lore as one of Family Guy's many internal contradictions, the kind of detail that appears because a story required it and then becomes part of the show's recorded history regardless of whether it fits everything around it. Taken at face value, the 1977 date suggests that Peter's relationship to that factory predated his relationship with Lois, predated the full Quahog social world the show built around him, and predated nearly every other fixed point in his adult life. He may have been a child when he started there. The show does not particularly care. Francis Griffin, Peter's strict adoptive father, worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory alongside his son for a period during the show's early run. The second season episode, Holy Crap, brings Francis to Quahog after his forced retirement from the Pawtucket Mill, and he ends up working at the toy factory for a stretch. Placing Francis and Peter in the same professional environment tells the audience almost everything it needs to know about that relationship in a compressed amount of time. Peter was already struggling to maintain his position under Mr. Weed. Having his father physically present in the same workplace, operating according to standards Peter could not meet at home and was not going to meet here either, was a particular kind of pressure. Francis believed that total devotion to work was a moral obligation, and that anything short of it represented a kind of spiritual failure. Peter's relationship to his safety inspector role had never been one of total devotion. It had been one of occasional presence and frequent sleeping. What Peter actually thought of the toy factory job is something the show addressed directly in a later season. In the episode Meg Stinks, Peter revealed that he had never liked working there at all. He had always wanted to be a podiatrist. Meg had assumed, apparently for her entire childhood, that her father found some meaning in his work, and this disclosure corrected that image in a specific way. The job he held for 3 full seasons of television, the job that defined the early shape of the show and appeared in its very first scene, was something Peter did because the household needed money and because he had landed there. By his own account, it was never what he would have chosen. Mr. Weed died at the Griffin family dinner table. In the 3rd season episode, Mr. Saturday Night, he came to the house for dinner at Peter's invitation, the invitation representing Peter's attempt to get himself noticed for a promotion. Brian had originally been choking on a dinner roll at the table, and when Brian recovered from the episode, the roll ended up in front of Mr. Weed. Mr. Weed then choked on it and died. The shock was enough that the promotion Mr. Weed had apparently been about to mention never got mentioned. Per the terms of Mr. Weed's video will, The happy-go-lucky toy factory was shut down. The building was demolished. In its place, the land was converted into a center providing care for the terminally ill, which is the kind of outcome that can only happen in a show that finds that kind of irony useful. 3 seasons, 3 firings, 1 corporate takeover, 1 death by dinner roll. The Toy Factory years gave Family Guy its opening structure, a show about a man who cannot quite hold a position even when the position was built for someone of limited responsibility, and who survives every professional disaster through some combination of luck, loopholes, and the fact that nobody around him ever fully stops giving him another chance. The factory is where Peter first demonstrated what his working life was going to look like across the rest of the series. The disasters would change. The basic shape of them would not. When the factory came down, Peter had no income, no plan, and no clear sense of where the next chapter was going. What he did have was time, an idea, and access to a police auction where someone was selling a boat. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 seasons at the Toy Factory ended with a dinner roll and a video will. With the building demolished and no paycheck coming in, Peter turned to the water and gave his new boat a name that takes longer to say than most job interviews. Section 3. The Fishermen. Losing the Toy Factory and losing a job are not always the same thing, and for Peter Griffin, they were never quite the same thing. He had been fired from the factory 3 times before Mr. Weed died. He had survived every one of those firings through a combination of filings, loopholes, and the particular brand of luck that seems to follow him regardless of what he does to deserve it. The factory closing was different. When the building came down immediately after the will was read, there was no mechanism to appeal, no disability claim to file, no sympathetic manager to sweet talk. Every worker was out. The job was gone in the same afternoon the factory was demolished. Peter Griffin was unemployed, and for the first time in his professional life, the position he had held was not coming back. What he did next tells a story about how Peter approaches a crisis. He did not update a resume. He did not make calls. He tried a variety of things in rapid succession, mostly based on whatever occurred to him at the time, and most of them did not work. Career Day at Chris's school had already revealed something Peter was aware of but preferred not to examine too closely. That even by the standards of Quahog, working at a toy factory as a safety inspector was not a job that generated admiration. The pharmacist, Mort Goldman, got a better response from the kids than Peter did. The gap between where Peter thought his professional life was heading and where it actually was had been quietly widening since before Mr. Weed died. Now it was fully visible. Among the options Peter explored during his unemployed stretch was prostitution. This was tried briefly and abandoned, partly because of the practical challenges involved, and partly because it was, as the episode acknowledged, illegal. The willingness to consider it at all says something about the range of options Peter was willing to entertain when genuinely pressed for income. He was not selective. He was available. If there was a market for a service he could plausibly provide, Peter was prepared to show up and see what happened. Prostitution turned out not to be his calling. What Lois offered instead was a memory. She reminded Peter of something he had wanted since he was young, to be a knight at a Renaissance fair. The aspiration had roots in a specific teenage experience. As a young man, Peter had an encounter with the fair's Black Knight, a figure who became something between an idol and an adversary in his imagination. The circumstances involved an acid trip, a rooftop, an attempt to fly, and the Black Knight appearing on horseback to prevent the outcome that would otherwise have followed. That memory, whatever else it was, had stayed with Peter. The Black Knight had saved his life and become the standard Peter quietly measured himself against, which is the kind of thing that happens when you are a certain type of person and you encounter a man in full armor on a horse at a formative moment. Peter enrolled in jousting training with Mort Goldman as his practice partner. His enthusiasm for the role was immediate and absolute. His patience for the linguistic conventions of Renaissance fair performance was much shorter. Speaking in the formal second-person style the fair required turned out to be a particular sticking point. The content of what Peter wanted to say was fine. The delivery format, with its these and thous and its particular cadence, kept falling apart. The physical training went better because it demanded effort rather than language, and effort was something Peter could apply once sufficiently motivated. The Black Knight, voiced by Will Ferrell, was the fair's reigning champion and operated with the energy of someone who had held a title long enough to feel entitled to it. When the knight's companion flirted with Peter, the knight responded by bullying him out of the competition and out of the fair entirely. Peter left dejected and watched the tournament from the stands. In the closing match, when the knight spotted Peter and began berating him in front of the crowd, something shifted. Peter challenged him. The jousting match that followed was heading toward a predictable conclusion when Mort Goldman, still working a side angle, arranged to have the knight's car towed. The Black Knight was distracted at the critical moment. Peter landed the winning hit, and the fair's champion went down. The fair offered Peter a permanent position as its new champion jouster after the victory. He turned it down. The family went home. And the episode ended in a way that Family Guy did not typically end. With Peter still unemployed, no resolution in sight, Lois referencing an old Honeymooners episode where Ralph also lost his job and did not get it back by the end. The Renaissance Fair chapter was closed before it had properly opened, and Peter was still without income or direction. Fishing was the next idea. The episode A Fish Out of Water, which aired the following week in September 2001, picked up the thread of Peter's jobless period and resolved it with a purchase. A police auction was selling a boat. Peter bid $50,000 for it, which is exactly the kind of financial decision that works if everything else goes right and is exactly the kind of financial decision Peter Griffin tends to make. He bought the boat. He decided he was a fisherman. He named the boat. The name he chose was the SS, more powerful than Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and the Incredible Hulk put together. This is not a brief name. It is not the kind of name that fits easily on a registration form or a marina slip or any of the other surfaces where a boat's name typically appears. It is a name that communicates a specific kind of confidence in the boat's capabilities, as well as in the naming person's approach to life more broadly. Peter had invested $50,000 in a vessel at auction, and he was going to name it in a way that left no ambiguity about how he felt about the decision. The name was the declaration of a man who had bet on himself in a big way and was prepared to announce it. Hennessy O'Callahan was the owner of the fishing company Peter signed on with, and he was not happy about it. Voiced by Michael Chiklis, Hennessy was a man who already had enough fishermen working for him and did not see what Peter specifically had to add. The feeling that Peter was surplus to what the operation required was something Hennessy communicated clearly and early. Working for an employer who actively did not want him was not an unusual situation in Peter's professional life, but it gave the fishing chapter a particular quality from the beginning. Peter was operating in a space where his presence was tolerated at best. The first fishing expedition Hennessy sent Peter to did not go smoothly. The spot Hennessy directed him toward was already occupied by another boat hosting a bar mitzvah. Peter's arrival at the location did not coexist peacefully with the celebration already underway. Mordecai, the dancing Yiddish clown, who had been performing at the event, ended up dead. The fact that this happened on Peter's first day on the water established the tone for what the fishing chapter of his career was going to be like. Santos and Pascoal arrived in a later episode, the two Portuguese migrant workers Peter hired to help operate the boat. They became regular presences in the fishing storylines of this period. Part of the crew that gave the SS more powerful than Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and the Incredible Hulk put together something resembling a functioning operation. They were, in practical terms, more competent than Peter at the actual work of fishing, which placed them in a category occupied by most people Peter has ever worked alongside. Seamus Levine is one of the more specific characters the show created for this chapter of Peter's life. A weathered fisherman with wooden limbs and an eye patch over one eye, Seamus was built as a deliberate parody of every salty sea dog character from maritime fiction. The man who knows the water, who has lost pieces of himself to it, and who emerges from the shadows at exactly the right moment to deliver a warning that the protagonist will almost certainly ignore. In A Fish Out of Water, Seamus materialized to warn Peter about the dangers of pursuing the episode's central quarry, a creature called Daggermouth, a large and apparently robotic fish that served as the episode's Moby Dick equivalent. The warning came with a specific visual gag of Seamus appearing dramatically in poor light to deliver it. The timing and staging were so deliberate that the show later repeated the exact structure in The Perfect Castaway, when Seamus again emerged from the shadows to warn Peter about something dangerous he was about to attempt at sea. The fishing career covered the second half of Season 3 and the first portion of Season 4. During this stretch, Peter's life on the water became a recurring backdrop rather than a constant foreground presence. The boat was there, the job was ongoing, and stories took place against that context without every episode being specifically about what it meant to be a fisherman. That structure mirrors what the Toy Factory years had been, a stable employment context that made Peter's professional life legible, while the actual comedic energy came from everything surrounding it. By the time the fourth season reached the episode The Perfect Castaway, things at the fishing business had started to deteriorate. Peter was having trouble catching enough fish to meet the business's basic requirements, the kind of slow decline that happens when the margin between success and failure in a small operation gets thin. Santos and Pascoal were let go. The workforce was down to Peter and whatever help he could recruit for specific trips. Seamus suggested Pelican's Reef as a fishing location rich enough to solve the problem. It was also known to be treacherous. Peter took the suggestion seriously enough to sail there and brought Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland along, ostensibly for help, but also because the free beer that came with joining Peter on the boat was an established incentive. They found the reef, they pulled in a substantial catch, and then a hurricane arrived. The storm destroyed the boat. The SS, more powerful than Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and the Incredible Hulk put together, which had been Peter's professional identity for several seasons of the show, went down in the hurricane. The four men survived on a raft assembled from Quagmire's inflatable doll collection, which is precisely the kind of survival detail that could only exist in Family Guy. While adrift before they reached the island, Peter revealed that he had been eating Joe's legs, which Joe did not immediately know how to respond to, given that his legs were paralyzed and therefore not providing him with sensory feedback. They eventually reached a deserted island and established themselves for what turned out to be several months. Back in Quahog, the 4 men were presumed dead. A memorial service was held. Carter Pewterschmidt attended and made a poorly timed joke about having expected Peter to die before him, which upset Lois and probably everyone else in the immediate vicinity. Brian stepped into the gap left by Peter's absence, finding work as a car salesman at a Quahog Hummer dealership, and eventually, in the particular logic the episode required, marrying Lois so that the family would have a stable financial and domestic structure. The marriage was real in legal terms. It was not the marriage that Lois actually wanted. The 4 men were eventually spotted from a cruise ship while attempting an activity the show does not need to explain further, and they were brought back to Quahog. Peter returned home to find that the household had reorganized around his absence. Lois had built a life with Brian. Untangling that situation took the remainder of the episode, with Peter and Lois reconnecting on terms that eventually convinced Brian to release his claim on the marriage and return things to how they had been before the hurricane. What Peter did not recover was the boat. The SS, more powerful than Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and the Incredible Hulk put together, was at the bottom of the ocean. Without it, there was no fishing business. Without the fishing business, there was no job. Peter Griffin was unemployed again, for the second time without the factory to fall back on, and for the first time in a very long while with no obvious plan for what came next. The fishing chapter had ended the same way most of the chapters in his working life end, with the primary asset destroyed and the job title no longer applicable. 3 seasons, 1 impossibly named boat, a hurricane, and a temporary dog husband later, Peter went to the unemployment office to find out what was available. What the office found for him was a position at the Pawtucket Brewery, which turned out to be the last job he would ever genuinely need. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The hurricane took the boat and the fishing career with it in a single afternoon. Peter went from fisherman to castaway to unemployed in 1 episode. And the unemployment office sent him somewhere he has never fully left since. A brewery in Quahog that makes beer he was already drinking before he worked there. Section 4. The Brewery. Pawtucket Patriot Ale is Peter Griffin's beer. Not just the beer he drinks most often, though that is true, but the beer that has come to represent something about who he is and where he comes from. Quahog is a working-class town, and Pawtucket Patriot Ale is a working-class beer. It sits in the refrigerator at 31 Spooner Street. It gets ordered at the Drunken Clam without deliberation. It is the kind of beer that does not require a decision, because the decision was made a long time ago. And starting from the middle of Season 4, it is also the beer that Peter Griffin gets paid to put in boxes and send out the door. For more than 20 seasons and counting, the Pawtucket Brewery has been the most stable feature of his professional life. The one job that has not ended in a firing, a hurricane, or a dinner roll. Long before Peter ever worked there, the brewery had already appeared in the show as a place of fascination. The second season episode, Wasted Talent, built an entire storyline around it. In the episode, the brewery's then owner, a man named Pawtucket Pat, hid 5 silver scrolls in randomly selected cans of Pawtucket Patriot Ale and announced that the 5 people who found them would receive a tour of the facility. The conceit was a direct parody of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, down to the structure of the contest, the specific shape of the tour, and the behavior of the tour's host. Pawtucket Pat functioned as a version of Willy Wonka, eccentric, theatrical, and possessed of a factory that operated according to its own internal logic. His workforce was a group of small orange beings called Chumbawambas, who served the same function as the Oompa Loompas from the original story. He sang a song called Pure Inebriation, which was a beer-themed parody of Pure Imagination. Peter found the last scroll, won a spot on the tour, brought Brian along, and was eventually expelled from the tour after the two of them sampled an experimental beer called Perma-Suds that had the effect of making them float toward the ceiling. They came back down by other means. The brewery got them banned. What made the Wasted Talent episode significant beyond its comedy was what it established about the brewery as a place. It was the factory behind Peter's favorite thing in the world, a location of genuine mythological weight in his imagination. The Silver Scroll contest, modeled after the Golden Ticket, was designed to make children want to find something hidden in a product. The show swapped chocolate for beer and children for Peter Griffin, and the underlying dynamic held. Peter wanted inside that factory the way a certain kind of person wants something they have built up in their mind for a long time. He got the tour. He got banned. And then a few seasons later, through a completely separate set of circumstances, he went back and stayed. Pawtucket Pat sold the brewery sometime after the Wasted Talent episode. The new ownership brought a different operational culture, and by the time Peter arrived looking for work, the whimsical Wonka-style environment was gone. The factory that Peter would spend most of the series' run working at was a normal brewery. Production line, shipping department, management hierarchy, and a set of workplace rules that applied to everyone, including Peter. Especially including Peter. The unemployment office sent Peter to Pawtucket in the 4th season episode Jungle Love, and the terms of the job were explained on his first day. The brewery offered its employees free access to beer on the condition that they did not drink during their shift. This was a reasonable policy for most employees. For Peter Griffin, it was an almost philosophical impossibility. He was working at a beer factory. The beer was available. The only rule was not to drink it. And Peter approached this constraint the way he approaches most constraints, by testing it immediately and failing completely. He overindulged. The breach was discovered, and Peter was removed from the production line and demoted before he had properly started. The demotion placed him in the shipping department, where his new coworker was a man named Opie. Opie was a mentally handicapped ward of the state, identified in the episode as someone deemed unfit for mainstream society. He was also, as Angela explained to Peter on his first day, Peter's superior. Opie communicated in ways Peter struggled to parse. On their first meeting, Opie indicated that he wanted Peter to place a finger in his mouth. Peter, advised that he needed to comply if he valued his position, did so. Opie bit him. The working relationship was established. Angela was the boss of the shipping department, and she became one of the most significant recurring characters in Peter's professional life. She was voiced by Carrie Fisher, who joined the show in Jungle Love in 2005 and continued in the role through roughly 25 episodes over the following decade. Angela was demanding, controlling, frequently cold toward Peter, and constitutionally unimpressed by him. She liked Opie considerably more than she liked Peter, which is a sentence that tells a story about the quality of Peter's performance. She was also the character through whom the show chose to flip the workplace harassment dynamic. In a later episode, it is Angela who pursues Peter, not the other way around. The 8th season episode, Peterasment, explored this directly. Angela developed an attraction to Peter after he stopped wearing his glasses, which altered his appearance enough for her to find him appealing. She pursued him with the kind of persistent, unwanted attention that Peter had historically been on the other side of. And Lois's response when Peter tried to explain what was happening was to wave it off on the grounds that men are supposed to enjoy being touched by women, and that his discomfort, therefore, did not qualify as harassment. The show was willing to note, through the setup of the storyline, that the same behavior reads differently depending on who is doing it. By the episode's resolution, Peter felt sorry enough for Angela, who revealed she had not dated anyone in a decade and was genuinely lonely, that he disguised himself as a fictional English billionaire and slept with her. Carrie Fisher played the scene the show required, and the result was an episode that managed to be both absurdist and, in a specific, understated way, sympathetic. Fuad was another member of the shipping department cast, an Arab-American co-worker who appeared across multiple episodes during the brewery years. His presence in the department alongside Peter added texture to what would otherwise be a very small corner of the Quahog work world. The shipping department was not the glamorous posting at the brewery. It was where people ended up when they could not handle where they started. Peter had been placed there because he could not follow the single most obvious rule on his first day of work, and Fuad and Opie and Angela constituted the professional community he navigated from that point forward. Mr. Carlyle, the brewery's CEO, appeared in the episode 3 Acts of God and became briefly important to Peter's ambitions at the company. Peter decided that impressing Carlyle was worth a dedicated effort, and the opportunity arose at a tailgate outside Gillette Stadium. Peter shot a hawk out of the sky with a crossbow in full view of the executive, and Carlyle responded to this display with what can charitably be described as complex admiration. He stroked Peter's cheek and offered to discuss a promotion through means that Peter did not immediately clarify to the audience. The crossbow moment became another entry in the long list of things Peter has done at his brewery job that raise questions about how he remains employed there. The most significant single event in the brewery's fictional history arrived in the season 13 premiere, a special one-hour crossover episode called The Simpsons Guy, which first aired in September 2014. The Griffin family, in the course of the episode, ends up in Springfield and spends time with the Simpson family. Peter introduces Homer to Pawtucket Patriot Ale. The two men argue about whose beer is better, and then someone at Moe's Tavern peels the label off a bottle of Pawtucket Patriot and finds a Duff beer label underneath. The implication that Pawtucket Patriot Ale is just Duff beer with a new label applied becomes the basis for a copyright infringement lawsuit. The case is tried before a judge who turns out to be Fred Flintstone. Fred ruled in favor of Duff, while also noting that both beers are imitations of his own Bud Rock. The Pawtucket Brewery faced closure as a consequence of the ruling. The crisis resolved because the Simpsons characters decided they could not be bothered to travel to Quahog to actually enforce the judgment. Peter's job survived by the specific grace of the other show's characters finding the commute inconvenient. Carter Pewterschmidt entered the brewery's story in a later episode when he purchased the facility and immediately announced his intention to cut costs by replacing certain materials in the beer cans with cheaper and chemically suspect alternatives. Peter discovered the plan and, instead of going to Carter directly, went to local investigative journalist Tricia Takanawa with the information. The decision to blow the whistle on his father-in-law over workplace safety at the brewery was one of the more consequential things Peter did as an employee there, and it speaks to the fact that the brewery, whatever else it represented, was a job he had real stakes in protecting. Carrie Fisher died on December 27, 2016, at 60 years old. She had been playing Angela for 11 years at that point, and the show chose to honor her in 2 stages. A January 2017 episode was dedicated to her. Then, nearly 2 years after her death, the episode Pawtucket Pete addressed Angela's absence directly by giving her a funeral and allowing Peter to deliver the eulogy. Peter stood at a podium in the rain with a piece of paper and began working through a series of lines borrowed from famous television theme songs. He acknowledged that death was hard for him. He said Angela died doing what she loved, which was swimming less than 20 minutes after eating, a cause of death that managed to be both absurd and oddly tender given the episode's emotional purpose. He said she had grace and courage and an unmatched enthusiasm for life, that she may be gone, but her voice would live on in formats where recorded material is preserved. He lifted his glasses and wiped his eyes. For a show that had built years of comedy out of Angela being uniformly unpleasant to Peter, the funeral was a genuine moment of care. The show was saying goodbye to Carrie Fisher through the character she had played, and it found a way to do it without abandoning its own identity. Bert and Sheila took over as the brewery's new managers after Angela's death. They were an interracial couple whose defining characteristic was a habit of finishing each other's sentences, which they did constantly and in tandem. The comedy of Bert and Sheila as management was gentler than Angela had been, more absurdist than confrontational. Peter's relationship to his bosses at the brewery has always been one of tension managed through accident and luck, and Bert and Sheila continued that tradition while giving the show new material to work with. What makes the brewery different from every other job Peter Griffin has ever held is the length. He has worked there for the majority of the show's run. The Toy Factory had 3 seasons. The fishing boat had roughly a season and a half. The brewery has had everything after that. More than 2 decades of episodes. More than 400 appearances of Peter as a man who works a shipping job at a beer factory in Quahog. He has been fired from the brewery. He has won the lottery and quit. He has returned. The brewery is the job that keeps reabsorbing him regardless of what intervenes, and the fact that it keeps doing so has made it something the other jobs never became: a permanent address in Peter's working life. The episode Peter, Chris, and Brian gave this a particular comic punctuation. In a time travel sequence, Peter's teenage self looked ahead at the future with optimism, listing the jobs he was glad he would not be stuck doing. The jobs he listed were ones the adult Peter had actually spent years performing, including the brewery. His younger self saw them as undesirable outcomes. The joke worked because the audience knew exactly how things had turned out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The brewery became the one job that stuck, the professional home Peter kept returning to no matter what else happened. But the shipping department and Angela were never the whole story of his working life. Some of Peter's most memorable jobs lasted 1 episode, and a few of them involved levels of power no one should have handed him. Section 5. The Power Jobs. 3 times across the show's run, Peter Griffin ended up in charge of something he had no business being in charge of. A tobacco company made him president of a toy company and sent him to lobby Congress in Season 2. A zoning accident in the same season made him the founding head of state of a sovereign nation called Pretoria. And a lap dance in Season 8 gave Carter Pewterschmidt a heart attack serious enough to put Peter in temporary control of a billion-dollar corporation. The mechanism was different each time. Peter's response was identical. He accepted whatever authority had arrived, moved into it without hesitation, and occupied the role completely until the situation eventually corrected itself. Season 2 of Family Guy produced the first version of this. The second season episode, Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington, was covered earlier in the context of the happy-go-lucky toy factory. But the episode belongs here too, because what happened in Washington was not really a toy factory story. It was a power story. El Dorado Cigarette Company bought the factory and needed a frontman, someone presentable enough to sit at a table in Congress, credible enough to be pointed at lawmakers, and pliable enough not to notice that he was being used. Peter fit 2 of those 3 criteria. They made him company president. El Dorado's calculation was operationally sound. They needed a person, a title, and access. Peter provided all 3, and he provided them with genuine enthusiasm. He understood himself as the president of a company. He showed up for the role. He attended the meetings and sat at the relevant tables and carried himself the way a president carries himself when the only qualification he can demonstrate is belief in the title. Washington received him in the way Washington receives people who present themselves with confidence, with some skepticism, some patience, and an interest in what he had to say. The role fit Peter in the specific way that roles with no defined limits fit him. There was no ceiling on what a president of a toy company acquired by a tobacco conglomerate was supposed to do in a day. There was no performance metric, no supervisor present, no structure that would have caught him doing something wrong before the consequences arrived. He went to meetings. He ate the food. He had the car. He did the things a man does when he is in Washington as a corporate representative, and nobody has explained to him that the whole enterprise is a setup. Lois understood what was happening before Peter did. She watched the gifts arrive at the family and saw the transaction underneath them. El Dorado was buying their silence and cooperation. They were buying Peter's willingness to stand in front of Congress and say what they needed Congress to hear. The show gave Lois this clarity because it was the kind of clarity she almost always has in situations where Peter is operating on enthusiasm rather than understanding. Peter was about to address Congress with prepared remarks when something changed the situation. Somewhere in the building, Stewie coughed. The association between tobacco products and children was one Peter made in real time, standing at the microphone, connecting the dots between what he was about to say and what that would mean for the people who would be affected. He abandoned the script. He said something honest instead. El Dorado got nothing from the arrangement they had built. Peter returned to his normal position at the factory. The presidency lasted as long as the trip to Washington, and not a moment longer. That first instance established the pattern in its clearest form. Authority offered, authority accepted, authority exercised, authority ended. The shape was the same as what followed. The scale got larger. Pool permits triggered the second and more elaborate version. Peter wanted a swimming pool. His neighbors had pools, and Peter wanted one too. He went to City Hall to apply for the necessary permits. This was an unusually organized approach to a problem by Peter's standards, and it should have resolved in the ordinary bureaucratic way. Permit granted, hole dug, pool installed. What it resolved in instead was the discovery that the Griffin property at 31 Spooner Street did not appear on any map. Not on the Quahog map, not on the Rhode Island map, not on any recorded map of the United States of America. City Hall confirmed the absence. Peter and Mayor Adam West reviewed the documentation together, and the conclusion was clear. The Griffin house existed on land that belonged to no existing jurisdiction. The country containing the house was open for whoever wanted to claim it. Peterland was his first choice of name. He wanted the country to be called Peterland, and he had the name ready. And then he discovered that a bar near the airport had already taken it. The bar was a gay bar, and it was called Peterland, and the name was therefore unavailable. Peter settled on Pretoria instead. He declared his home a sovereign nation. He was its founding citizen, its first and only government, and its president from the moment of declaration. Pretoria was born on Spooner Street in Quahog, Rhode Island, covering one residential lot. The General Assembly of the United Nations did not receive Pretoria with enthusiasm. Peter attended and made the case for recognition. The assembled representatives of the world's nations were not persuaded that a country consisting of a single house in New England warranted a seat at the table. They mocked him instead. which is the reception that a new nation without territory, population, infrastructure, or international allies should probably expect when it arrives at the UN, led by a man who had recently been a toy factory safety inspector. Diplomatic advice arrived from a surprising source. An Iraqi representative at the UN told Peter that respect came from expansion, that nations gained standing by taking what they wanted rather than asking for it. Peter absorbed this counsel without placing it in any geopolitical context and applied it directly to the most obvious territorial opportunity available. Joe Swanson had a pool. Joe lived next door. Joe's pool was clearly an asset, clearly inside what Peter could define as a sphere of interest, and clearly something that would improve Pretoria's standing as a nation with actual amenities. Joe was the name Peter gave to Joe's pool after annexing it. The annexation was formalized in the way Pretoria formalized things. Peter declared it, which meant it was so. The pool party that followed was attended by Fidel Castro, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and Slobodan Milosevic, four of the most internationally scrutinized political figures of the late 20th century accepted an invitation to use a pool in a Quahog backyard. The gathering happened because Peter had invited people who recognized his credentials as a fellow head of state, and because none of them, apparently, had anything more pressing to do that weekend than attend a party in Rhode Island. Military response came from the United States government within the time frame that an invasion of American soil required. Operation Desert Clam surrounded the Pretoria border, which ran along the edges of the Griffin property on Spooner Street. Tanks positioned themselves at the perimeter. Electricity was cut. Gas was cut. Water was cut. The blockade was designed to make continued resistance impractical, and it was succeeding in that design. The conditions inside Pretoria deteriorated as the utilities disappeared. Lois packed the children and left. They walked from the Griffin property into the United States, a distance of approximately the width of the front lawn, and constituted themselves as refugees from their own household. Pretoria had lost most of its population. The Allied world leaders had presumably departed. Peter remained, alone, blockaded, and in possession of a pool he had stolen from his neighbor, still president of a nation that nobody recognized, and that was now operating without running water. Peter refused to leave. The logic available to him was the logic of a man who had decided that the thing he was doing was real, and that the reality of it required him to hold his position regardless of the practical argument against doing so. He was a president. Presidents did not simply walk away because the situation became uncomfortable. He held Joe. The repatriation came eventually because the position became indefensible. The episode staged the surrender without ceremony. Negotiations, return of the pool, Peter back in the United States. The country of Pretoria dissolved as formally as it had been created. The terms required him to return Joe's pool, which he did. Joe got his pool back. Peter got his utilities restored. The country he had governed for the duration of the episode ceased to exist. The episode itself was named after the Latin phrase found on American currency, with one word changed. E pluribus unum means out of many, one, and has been the national motto since the country's founding. Peterbus unum meant something smaller and more personal. Out of everything, Peter. The name was the joke delivered in advance. 9 seasons after Pretoria dissolved, Carter Pewterschmidt had never had a bachelor party. Peter discovered this at a family gathering on Carter's yacht in the 8th season episode Business Guy, and treated the information as a problem requiring immediate solution. He organized the event at a venue called the Fuzzy Clam, with entertainment appropriate to a bachelor party. And Carter arrived and experienced all of it. Peter decided to give Carter a lap dance at the Fuzzy Clam, and the combination of the excitement and Carter's age produced a heart attack. Carter went into a coma. Dr. Gregory House was brought in to assess the situation. House, voiced by Hugh Laurie, reprising his character from the long-running Fox medical drama, examined Carter and confirmed the coma through methods that included punching Carter in the face to verify his lack of response. The diagnosis was accurate. Carter was not going anywhere. Lois was given control of Pewterschmidt Industries by the terms of Carter's recorded will. She knew nothing about running a corporation of that scale, and Carter's board of directors was prepared to manage the operation in his absence. Peter argued against the sensible arrangement. He told Lois that following the established process was the rulebook and that he did not play by the rulebook. Dr. House, present in the room and asked to weigh in, allowed that he himself operated outside institutional constraints. Peter got the company. Authority over a billion-dollar empire suited Peter the way all power suits him, completely, immediately, and without any calibration toward what the role actually required. He walked into Pewterschmidt Industries as its acting head and began making decisions at the pace of a man who had no experience making them at that scale. The board of directors was the first thing to go. He fired all of them on his first day. He replaced the positions they had held with people he knew personally. Mort Goldman, the neighborhood pharmacist. Quagmire, the airline pilot. Brian, the family dog. None of them had corporate governance experience. Peter did not identify this as relevant. Development of new items at Pewterschmidt Industries proceeded at a pace and in a direction that reflected Peter's unfiltered thinking. The African-American heart monitor was engineered to beep faster when the device detected proximity to white people. Jeremy Irons' cereal placed the actor's image on every box of a breakfast product without any rationale visible in the episode. Neither item had passed through a development process involving market research or regulatory review. They existed because Peter had thought of them and had the resources to make them real, and because nobody in the building had the authority to stop him. The board was gone. Peter was the authority. When Lois pressed him to return control of the company, Peter raised the question of whether the name Lacey Chabert meant anything to her. Chabert had been the original voice of Meg before leaving the role in the show's early seasons. The implication was clear. The show had replaced one person in the family before, and Peter, as the person currently controlling a large corporation, was in a position to suggest that the same could happen to Lois. It was a threat made in the specific language of the show's production history, which is the kind of meta-joke that Family Guy was constructed to be able to make. Lois was not particularly moved by it. Carter woke from his coma wanting the company back. Peter refused. He had grown into the title. He was Peter Griffin, head of Pewterschmidt Industries, and the fact that he had held the position for less than a week and had used it primarily to fire qualified executives and develop heart monitors calibrated for racial anxiety did not diminish his attachment to what the title represented. He was in charge. He intended to remain in charge. Lois and Carter's approach to resolving the situation involved a fabricated monster in the company's basement. They told Peter there had been sightings of a swamp creature in the building's lower levels, on the theory that Peter's curiosity about swamp creatures would override his attachment to the CEO position. The theory was correct. Peter went to the basement. In the basement, Dr. Gregory House revealed himself to be a swamp monster. The show staged this with complete commitment, as if the information that the most prominent diagnostician on American television was also a swamp creature living in the sub-basement of a billion-dollar corporation was simply the next logical beat in the episode. House was the swamp monster. This was true. Peter had gone into the basement to investigate a fabricated monster and found a real one instead, which is a specific type of outcome that only the show's particular flavor of absurdism could produce. Control of Pewterschmidt Industries returned to Carter. Peter walked out of the basement, out of the title, and back into his life on Spooner Street. Carter had his company. Peter had the story. 3 separate episodes across 8 seasons of television. The Cigarette Company Presidency in Season 2, Pretoria across Season 2 as well, and Pewterschmidt Industries in Season 8. 3 different mechanisms delivering 3 different flavors of disproportionate authority into Peter's hands. El Dorado used him as a vehicle. The zoning accident made him a head of state. Carter's heart attack made him a Fortune 500 executive. The mechanism changed each time. The response was identical. Each episode followed the same internal shape. Authority arrives. Peter occupies it with immediate sincerity. The occupation produces results that confirm he should not have been in the position. The position is taken back. Peter returns to where he started. The toy factory, Spooner Street, the brewery. The power jobs are excursions, not destinations. They open, run their course, and close. And Peter exits from each of them roughly where he entered, without apparent damage and without apparent growth. He was not built for power. He is also, evidently, incapable of refusing it when it appears. The speed at which Peter fills a role is the same whether the role is appropriate or not. This is the characteristic that makes the power jobs distinct from the jobs that failed because Peter was unqualified. The news segment failed because of a drunk driving scandal. The pirate career failed because the parrot died. Both of those failures were external events that ended external situations. The power jobs fail because Peter is Peter, inside the position, making Peter decisions, until the structure around him collapses under the weight of those decisions. The failure is always internal. The mechanism is always the same man. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Pretoria dissolved when Peter ran out of running water. Pewterschmidt Industries recovered when Carter woke up. Next, Peter finds his way into jobs that are less about ruling and more about performing, including one that made him briefly famous and one that made him a pirate. Section 6. The Performer. Getting famous is not something Peter Griffin has ever pursued through conventional means. He has never sent a headshot to anyone. He has never applied for airtime. He does not strategize his public image, mostly because he appears to be unaware that such a thing as public image exists. What Peter has done, several times across the show's run, is stumble into a format that fits his personality so precisely that the fit looks like design. 2 of his most memorable jobs were like this. One put him behind a news desk to say whatever was actually on his mind, and the other gave him a parrot and let the rest take care of itself. Lackluster Video was a chain that moved into Quahog when a local store called Sal's Video was bought out, and it brought with it a corporate policy about what kinds of films it would and would not sell. The policy took a particular position on adult content. No pornography. The store claimed 50,000 locations nationwide and a strong moral stance against anything that did not meet a certain definition of acceptable viewing. Peter Griffin found this unacceptable. He walked into the store, encountered the policy at the counter, and began arguing with the clerk about it in terms that touched on theology, on the specific language of Scripture, and on the practical reality that the Bible was, in his assessment, too long to have read. Tom Tucker, the anchor of Quahog 5 News, was in the store at the same moment on a similar errand. Tucker listened to Peter's rant at the counter and made a professional calculation. He was looking for someone who could fill an everyman commentary segment on the evening news, someone who spoke the way actual people in Quahog spoke, who had genuine things to say about genuine frustrations, who was not reading from prepared remarks. Peter Griffin, mid-argument with a video store clerk about whether Scripture condemned adult films, was clearly that person. Tucker approached him after the rant concluded and offered him a slot on Quahog 5 News to do a version of what he had just been doing for free. Peter accepted. The segment was called "You Know What Really Grinds My Gears?" and it aired on Quahog 5 News as a recurring feature alongside anchors Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons. The format was simple. Peter sat at the news desk and complained about things. No script, no filter, no preparation visible to the viewer. Whatever was bothering him that week went on television and was delivered to the homes of Quahog residents as part of the evening news broadcast. His debut rant returned to the video store complaint, the one that had caught Tucker's attention. Peter argued, live on air, that he could not find a passage in the Bible that clearly prohibited a man from enjoying adult material in his neighbor's living room while the neighbor was at work, and that the reason he could not find such a passage was that the Bible was too long to have read all the way through. He delivered this with complete sincerity, as a man raising a genuine logical concern rather than making a joke. The audience found it compelling. Subsequent segments branched into other territory. Bread, Peter observed, is manufactured in a square shape. Bologna, the lunch meat that bread exists to carry, is manufactured in a round shape. These dimensions are incompatible. Someone, somewhere, made this design decision, and Peter wanted to know who and why. His inability to locate specific droids, a reference to Star Wars that the show delivered through a cutaway showing a stormtrooper agreeing that he also found the whole droid situation confusing, made it on air. The 30-year absence of a genuinely good priest and rabbi joke was documented. X-ray glasses that did not work as advertised received dedicated coverage. Parents who allowed their children to do whatever they wanted were called to account. The segment became one of the more popular things airing on Quahog 5 News. The audience responded to Peter's specific combination of genuine irritation and complete absence of self-consciousness. He was not performing outrage for effect. He was a man with a list of complaints and a platform to deliver them. This was exactly what Tucker had identified in the video store, and exactly what made the format work. It also made Tom Tucker feel the particular discomfort of a man who built his career on being the most prominent face in a newsroom, watching someone with no training or credentials become more popular than he was. Tucker's jealousy moved him to action. He began attempting to sabotage Peter's segments from within the newsroom, using his access to the desk and the broadcast schedule to interrupt and undermine. The network, which had a clearer view of what was happening than Tucker gave them credit for, observed this behavior and drew the appropriate conclusion. Tucker was fired. His mustache, which turned out to belong to the studio and not to Tucker personally, was returned to the station. Tucker was now an unemployed former anchor who could not figure out how to check his email from home, which was the specific condition in which the episode found him when he showed up uninvited at the news desk while Peter was still mid-broadcast. Diane Simmons told him he no longer worked there. The station's weatherman, Ollie Williams, offered to help with the email situation. Peter's final segment, in what turned out to be his last broadcast at Quahog 5 News, concerned people living in the 19th century who had not yet adjusted to the existence of automobiles. He delivered this with the same conviction applied to every previous topic. Diane Simmons introduced him that night as a neglectful father and Quahog's newest social pariah, a description that had become part of the standard on-air framing the show had given his segment by its final weeks. The introduction was not meant as a compliment. Peter did not appear to register it as an insult. During the broadcast, word arrived that Peter had been fired. He was informed of this on air, mid-segment, while still holding the desk. His response was brief and unambiguous. He said that since he was no longer working there, he had one more thing to say. And then he said what he actually thought of the situation, directed at the country as a whole, in language that the evening news does not typically carry. The moment was Peter Griffin at his most distilled. Given nothing to lose, he said the truest version of what was on his mind. What closed the chapter was not Peter's firing, but what Tucker did next. Stewie and Brian had been out together, and, in the circumstances of the episode's parallel storyline, had ended up driving drunk and crashing the car into the side of the drunken clam. Tucker obtained this information and broke it as a news story, framing it as a story about the family of Quahog's newest social commentator. The station had the scandal it needed to explain the end of Peter's segment. Tucker had the story he needed to walk back into the newsroom and reclaim his desk. His mustache was reattached to his face. The segment was over. The show's creators acknowledged that what really grinds my gears was a conscious echo of the 1976 film Network, in which a news anchor facing termination begins delivering unfiltered rants on air, becomes a ratings phenomenon, and eventually has the popularity of his honesty used against him by the system that briefly benefited from it. Peter's version collapsed the arc to a single episode. He arrived, ranted, got popular, got fired, said what he thought on the way out. The whole arc of the network story in one focused burst. What the news job reveals, more clearly than most things Peter has attempted professionally, is that his limitations as an employee exist almost entirely at the level of institutional constraint. Left alone with a microphone and told to say what was on his mind, he did something that worked. The format contained no requirement to show up on time, produce things carefully, collaborate with people he might undermine, or perform tasks that required technical competence. The format asked only for Peter Griffin to be Peter Griffin, and in that specific context, the result was popular enough to make Tom Tucker unemployed. 2 years after the segment ended, a parrot changed Peter's professional identity again. The setup was a routine family errand. Brian had developed stomach pains, and the family brought him to Dr. Jewish's veterinary office for examination. Brian's visit gave Peter time in the waiting room, and the waiting room had a parrot. Peter became attached to the parrot in the way Peter becomes attached to things, completely and immediately. He stole the parrot, replacing it in its enclosure with a dog wearing a small hat and a drawn-on mustache. He named the parrot Adrian Beakey, a reference to the actor Adrian Brody, whose distinctive nose the parrot's beak was apparently thought to resemble. Carrying a parrot changed how Peter moved through the world, and his friends were the ones who named what he had become. They pointed out that a man who carried a parrot on his shoulder had a particular aesthetic, and that the aesthetic had a name. They suggested he dress accordingly. Peter absorbed this suggestion with the same total commitment he applies to most suggestions, and the costume followed. He assembled 3 other pirates from his social circle and organized them into an enterprise he named Long John Peter, which was both an identity and a working arrangement. The enterprise operated through Quahog as pirates had once operated through coastal waters, by identifying targets, approaching with force and noise, and taking what could be taken. Their most significant operation targeted a British man named Shelley Boothbishop, who was driving a car loaded with sugarcane, tobacco, and spices, the kind of cargo that historically made merchant ships worth attacking. What followed was a high-speed chase that the show staged with the visual glamour of an 18th-century naval battle. The cars operated as ships. The crew fired at each other. The fight between Peter and Boothbishop involved swords, conducted while standing on moving vehicles. Boothbishop, when Peter forced his car into water, straightened his posture, saluted, and hummed "Rule Britannia" as he and the vehicle went under. The commitment to the bit on both sides of the conflict was total. Adrian Beakey was gravely injured during the attack. The parrot was taken back to Dr. Jewish's office, where it died under what the episode described as reportedly humiliating circumstances. The piracy career ended, not with a formal conclusion or a decision, but with the absence of the thing that had started it. Without the parrot, Peter was not a pirate. He transitioned his attention to a pipe organ, which is its own kind of instrument, but not a pirate-specific one. Dr. Jewish was voiced by Bryan Cranston. Cranston had appeared in a range of television work before this episode, including a long run on Malcolm in the Middle that made him well known in family comedy circles. In January 2008, 4 months before Long John Peter aired, a show called Breaking Bad had begun its first season on AMC. The show starred Cranston as a high school chemistry teacher who began cooking methamphetamine after a cancer diagnosis. It was still in its first season when Long John Peter aired. The version of Bryan Cranston that audiences knew in May 2008 was largely the one from Malcolm in the Middle, the version that he was in the process of becoming. One of the most acclaimed dramatic actors on American television was only just beginning to take shape. His brief appearance as a vet in a Family Guy pirate episode occupies an interesting position in his biography. It arrived right at the edge of the transformation. Amanda Bynes voiced Anna, the veterinary intern with whom Chris fell in love during Brian's checkup. Anna appeared for this episode and was not seen again after it, which was noted by the show's commentary as a recurring pattern for characters Chris developed feelings for. Bynes had built her career through live-action comedy on television and in films, and her voice work in this episode was part of a brief exploration of animation. She stepped back from acting in 2010, roughly 2 years after Long John Peter aired. The episode sits near the end of her active career. The 6th season of Family Guy was shorter than intended because the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike interrupted production. The strike ran from November 2007 through February 2008 and affected shows across the industry. Long John Peter, as the 12th episode of the season, was the finale by necessity rather than by design. Seth MacFarlane was among the many television creators who participated in the strike. The shortened season gave Long John Peter a different kind of weight in the show's history, an episode that became a finale without being built as one, ending a season mid-conversation because the circumstances outside the show required it. Both the news segment and the pirate chapter work as jobs because of what they require from Peter. Neither asked him to suppress or manage anything. The news segment asked him to say what annoyed him. The pirate role asked him to dress the part and act accordingly. In both cases, the gap between what Peter is and what the position needed turned out to be essentially zero. He was the ideal candidate for a job that asked for Peter Griffin, and both positions were, in different ways, exactly that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The news segment lasted one broadcast run before a car crash ended it. The pirate career lasted until the parrot died. Next, Peter tries his hand at two ventures that required capital investment, planning, and a long-term strategy, which is exactly the kind of description that should make anyone nervous about what happened next. Section 7. The Entrepreneur. The chain of events that produced Big Pete's House of Munch began not with any entrepreneurial ambition, but with Mort Goldman borrowing Peter's things too often. Mort lived nearby, had a habit of returning to the Griffin house to borrow various items, and had apparently pushed that habit past a threshold Peter found unacceptable. Peter's solution was to build a scarecrow in the yard, shaped like Adolf Hitler, on the theory that such a figure would deter Mort specifically, which it did the moment Mort arrived to return something he had borrowed. The scarecrow was also Peter's good suit. When Lois discovered this and took him to a thrift store to find a replacement, Peter found something more interesting than a suit: a pair of flannel foot pajamas. He bought them. He wore them. And he discovered that wearing them while walking across carpeted surfaces generated sufficient static electricity to deliver a measurable shock to anyone he touched. For several days, Peter used this discovery as the basis for what the episode treated as a superhero identity. He shocked people constantly, Brian, Lois, everyone within reach, and found the effect consistently amusing. The household's carpets were what made this possible, and Lois's response was to hire Quagmire to rip all of them out. When the carpet came up, something was underneath it. A coin. The coin turned out to be rare and valuable, worth $50,000 when sold. Peter and Lois decided to use the money to open a restaurant. Big Pete's House of Munch was the name they chose. The restaurant sat in Quahog as a concrete expression of something the show returns to periodically: Peter and Lois with a project between them that they genuinely want to work, approached with an optimism the show is usually about to complicate. The early weeks of the restaurant were difficult. The business did not attract customers in the numbers it needed. The food was going out, the tables were filling slowly, and the economics of the operation were trending in the direction of the coin running out before the restaurant found its footing. Joe Swanson offered to help by bringing friends. Peter was specific about what he wanted the restaurant to become: a place where police officers hung out, a certain kind of Quahog establishment with a particular social energy. Joe's friendship with people on the force was what made this seem achievable. Peter agreed to let Joe bring his crowd. When the crowd arrived, it was not police officers. Joe was paraplegic, and the friends he brought were fellow wheelchair users, veterans, civilians, people who had found in Joe's social circle a community organized around shared experience. They loved the restaurant. They came back. Big Pete's House of Munch became, in a short period, a genuinely successful business. Peter was not pleased. He surveyed the dining room and concluded that the restaurant he had imagined, the cool place he had pictured, had become something he described as a cafeteria for the Veterans Hospital. The logic he applied to this conclusion was specific and unambiguous. Mark Harmon, the actor, did not use a wheelchair. Mark Harmon was cool. Wheelchair users were therefore not cool, and a cool restaurant was not a place that should accommodate them. Peter announced a policy: no wheelchairs. Customers in wheelchairs were to be turned away at the door of Big Pete's House of Munch, effective immediately. Joe's response was measured at first, and then was not. He organized. The wheelchair users who had made the restaurant viable gathered outside and united into a formation the episode named Crippletron, a giant robot-like structure assembled from the bodies and chairs of the group, with Joe as the commanding element at the top. Crippletron moved on the restaurant with the slow, deliberate energy of something large that knows it will get where it is going. The building took damage. The structure fell. When Crippletron collapsed, it fell on Peter. He was trapped under the rubble with a broken leg, in need of assistance, looking up at Ben Stiller, who had landed nearby in the wreckage. Peter asked for help. Stiller declined. He had heard what Peter said about his movies, and the critique had been pointed enough that Stiller was prepared to leave him under the ruins of his own restaurant rather than extend a hand. Peter responded by telling Stiller to go to a place that was not this one, and called him the mutant offspring of comedy people. Stiller left. Peter was extracted eventually, put into a wheelchair, and sent home to recover. 45 minutes in the wheelchair was enough for Peter to understand what he had done. He went to Joe's house, rang the bell, and apologized. He told Joe that he had been in the chair for less than an hour and already understood how hard it was, and that he was sorry for the policy and for the week that followed from it. Joe told Peter it meant a lot to hear that. The restaurant was destroyed. The $50,000 coin was spent, and the business was over. But Peter had arrived at the apology under his own power, which was not nothing. Patrick Stewart appeared in the episode in a brief and specific way. Peter acquired his vocal cords for a scene and delivered a line in Stewart's measured, theatrical voice. The joke depended on the complete disconnect between Stewart's bearing and whatever Peter was saying. The content of the line, in the version that aired and in the version on the DVD, was different. The broadcast version had Peter making a list of famous Armenians, while the home release version had him describing a bathroom incident in detailed terms that the network version declined to carry. Either way, the gag was Peter Griffin communicating like Patrick Stewart, which was funny in both directions. What Big Pete's House of Munch tells about Peter as a businessman is the same thing his other ventures tell. He is a capable enthusiast and a disastrous strategist. The restaurant worked. The product was good enough. The location was functional. The customer base arrived without Peter having to find them. He had, through Joe's generosity, a sustainable business handed to him in good condition. He then developed a policy based on his personal aesthetic judgment about coolness, implemented it against the advice of anyone who might have advised him, and lost the business as a direct consequence. The decision to ban wheelchair users was not a business decision. It was a Peter decision. The distinction matters because it was a Peter decision that destroyed a business, which is the precise shape of how Peter's professional life tends to resolve. 6 years after the restaurant closed, a different kind of venture began, in much more dramatic circumstances. The 11th season episode Farmer Guy, which first aired in May 2013, opened with a quahog that had deteriorated sharply. The crime rate had climbed in ways the show illustrated through a series of specific incidents. Quagmire was mugged by someone who had no idea who Truman Capote was. A seal at the local ocean world threatened its trainer and demanded more fish. A baby was born in a hospital carrying a gun and ran through the corridors firing it. These were the conditions of the city Peter was trying to raise a family in. Coming home from an outing, the Griffins discovered that their house on Spooner Street had been robbed while they were out. The violation was enough to change Peter's calculus about quahog entirely. He announced the family was moving. He sold the house on Craigslist and identified a farm in the Rhode Island countryside as the new location. The farmer who owned it quoted a price of more than $800,000. Peter turned to the camera and noted that Fox normally called ahead and paid for his situations, and at that moment, the farmer received a phone call from Fox. The transaction proceeded. Brian's response to being told the family was moving to a farm was not relief. A dog being told he is being taken to a farm carries a specific cultural weight, and Brian understood that weight. He suspected he was being euthanized, and briefly took Stewie hostage before the circumstances were clarified enough for him to get in the car. The drive to the farm was tense. Once there, the family adjusted with varying degrees of success. The farm required skills none of them had, and Lois's accounting of their financial situation after the first stretch of operation was not encouraging. The crops were not producing income at a rate that covered expenses. They were hemorrhaging money in a way that the farm was not going to correct through normal agricultural means. Brian, attempting to help, enrolled at an agricultural college to learn how to manage the operation properly. He drove away. The farm continued to fall apart in his absence. The tornado arrived while Peter and Lois and the children were managing a farm they did not know how to run with money they did not have. When it appeared on the horizon, Peter initially proposed that it might be a Tasmanian devil. The family moved to the storm cellar. In the cellar, they found a methamphetamine laboratory, fully equipped and apparently operational, left by whoever had owned the property before them. Lois's first response was correct. She wanted to call the police. The lab was clearly illegal, and the family had nothing to do with it. This was the rational, legal, obvious choice. Peter's response was to do the math on their financial situation and arrive at a different conclusion. The lab existed, the materials were there, the equipment was ready. They needed money. He presented this as a practical solution to a cash flow problem rather than as a decision to enter the illegal drug trade, which was the thing it actually was. Lois, under genuine financial pressure, agreed to help for a limited period. Peter ran the operation with the intensity and paranoia that the show used to parody Breaking Bad, the AMC drama that had become a cultural touchstone by 2013. He developed a carrier pigeon delivery system because carrier pigeons were available at the farm and Peter trusted them in the way Peter trusts things that seem to be working. Stewie established a side operation selling cough syrup to children, which branched off from the main enterprise and operated according to Stewie's own commercial instincts. The farm had become a functioning drug distribution center with two separate revenue streams. Brian returned from agricultural college to find a situation that bore no relationship to what he had left. A news report soon established that the Griffins were responsible for a significant increase in drug availability in Quahog, which had the effect of worsening the very crime problem that had driven them from the city in the first place. Lois made the decision. They were going home. The farm could not stay. As the family left, the farm exploded. The Spooner Street house was available for repurchase because property values in Quahog had collapsed during the crime wave that Peter's meth operation had contributed to. They bought it back. A former customer appeared at the door looking for more product. That was where the episode left things. Breaking Bad had premiered in January 2008 and ran through September 2013. Farmer Guy aired in May 2013, while Breaking Bad was still on the air and in the middle of what would become its final run of episodes. The parody was current in the specific way that Family Guy's cultural commentary tends to be, not retrospective, but aimed at something the audience was actively watching and talking about. Peter, as Walter White, was funny partly because of how far Peter was from Walter White in every relevant dimension, and partly because the show trusted the audience to hold both images simultaneously. Big Pete's House of Munch and the farm operation share a structure that repeats across both. A financial opportunity arrives. Peter seizes it with genuine enthusiasm and without adequate planning. The business works for a stretch, long enough to establish that the idea was not entirely wrong. Then something happens. a ban on wheelchairs, a meth lab in the cellar. That is entirely Peter's doing, or at least Peter's continuation. The business ends in catastrophe, and Peter ends up in roughly the same position he was in before it started. The restaurant cost a coin and a carpet. The farm cost a house and a season's worth of Quahog's drug supply. In both cases, what Peter walked away from was everything he had put in, and a lesson he probably learned for about 45 minutes before forgetting it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The restaurant burned through $50,000 and ended when Crippletron fell on it. The farm burned through everything else and then literally burned. Next, Peter puts on a uniform, 2 different ones across 2 different episodes, and discovers what happens when the city of Quahog hands him a badge. Section 8. The Uniform. Tom Brady watched Peter knock over an entire room of people at a high school reunion in January 2006 and decided that kind of force belonged on the New England Patriots roster. That was one uniform. The other arrived later that same year when Mayor Adam West deployed the entire Quahog Police Department to Columbia after mistaking Romancing the Stone for a factual account of real events, leaving Joe Swanson as the city's only active officer and Peter as the only available body willing to fill the gap. Neither position came through an application process. Both came through the specific circumstances that Family Guy has always used to place Peter somewhere he was not remotely qualified to be. The high school reunion was the setup. In the 4th season episode, Patriot Games, which aired on January 29, 2006, 1 week before Super Bowl 40, Peter attended a reunion of his former classmates and made a decision about how to present himself. He arrived telling people he was a secret agent astronaut millionaire who wore a cowboy hat. This identity covered several categories of impressive simultaneously: intelligence community, space program, wealth, and a fashion choice that communicated confidence. The reunion crowd received this information. Tom Brady was also at the reunion, in the particular coincidence that Family Guy treats as a reasonable thing for an episode to contain. Peter's cover story collapsed when he encountered Brady directly. The social pressure of being in the same room as someone who actually had extraordinary achievements pushed Peter past his self-presentation and into his actual behavior. He got drunk and had to run to the bathroom. Between Peter and the bathroom was a significant portion of the reunion's guest list, and Peter went through them the way a running back goes through a defensive line, with speed, force, and no apparent concern for the people in his path. Brady watched this happen and assessed it professionally. A man who could move like that through a crowd was a man the New England Patriots could use. Brady's offer placed Peter in the starting lineup as the team's center. The role suited him in the specific way that most physically demanding jobs in Peter's career suit him. His body is built for force, in the way it is not built for precision or patience. And the Patriots, at least in the early weeks of his tenure, benefited from what he brought to the field. He won games. The city around him responded. The Griffins settled into the life that came with having a family member on a professional football team, which involved a new level of public visibility and a new level of domestic comfort. What Peter brought to the role alongside his physical effectiveness was the same thing he brings to every role: an enthusiastic inability to understand what the limits of the position actually are. The New England Patriots had a tolerance for outsized personality in its players, as most professional sports organizations do, but that tolerance has a ceiling. Peter located the ceiling in a game against the Dallas Cowboys and went directly through it. After scoring a touchdown, he drove a vehicle onto the field and launched into a fully choreographed production of Shapoopy, a song from the 1957 musical The Music Man. The performance was not brief. It involved the entire stadium. Al Michaels and John Madden watched from the press box as Peter Griffin turned a professional football game into a musical number. The choreographed celebration was the final straw for the team. Peter was dismissed from the Patriots immediately. He had scored touchdowns, he had won games, he had done the actual work well enough. But the shapoopy performance on the Dallas Cowboys field was a decision that no coaching staff was prepared to accommodate. And Peter was traded to the only team willing to take him, the London Sillinannies, a fictional British football franchise that the show presented as having no particular grasp of how the game was supposed to be played. London presented Peter with a new challenge, a team that was cheerful and accommodating and entirely without the physical or tactical foundation that professional American football requires. He attempted to address the toughness gap by introducing steroids into the team's preparation, a decision that he framed as a practical solution to a problem that needed solving. The steroids had an effect, but not the intended one. The Sillinannies became more animated in their leisure time. During what the episode depicted as a team bonding session, they engaged in a pillow fight while dressed in nightshirts. The aggression Peter was trying to cultivate did not translate into football aggression. He challenged the Patriots anyway. Peter organized a game between the Sillinannies and the team that had fired him, apparently as a way of settling the professional separation on his own terms. The opening kickoff provided an immediate and clear answer to the question of whether this had been a good idea. As the Patriots came forward, the Sillinannies assessed the situation and made a collective decision. They ran away. Every member of Peter's team fled the field, leaving Peter standing alone facing the full New England Patriots roster. He played. He was defeated with the speed and totality that the situation required. Brady's response to what he had just watched was not contempt. He approached Peter and told him he respected him for having the nerve to stand there and face the Patriots by himself when every rational signal in the situation said to leave. The statement landed as the episode's emotional resolution. A man who had been fired from the team for excess, who had then failed to prepare an alternative team adequately, who had just been physically overwhelmed by former colleagues, received the respect of the quarterback who had started the whole thing. They returned to Quahog. The football career was over. Running alongside the main storyline in Patriot games was a subplot that involved Stewie operating as a sports bookie. Brian had bet $50 on the outcome of a celebrity boxing match between Mike Tyson and Carol Channing, lost, and found himself unable to meet the debt on the schedule Stewie required. Stewie responded to non-payment with physical violence, which escalated as Brian attempted to avoid him using disguises. Brian eventually disguised himself with a fake mustache. Stewie eventually shoved him in front of a moving bus. The subplot and the main storyline ran in parallel without crossing, which is a structural approach Family Guy uses when it wants two separate tones in the same episode. The episode aired as close to Super Bowl Sunday as the broadcast schedule would allow, placing it in a week when professional football was the dominant cultural conversation. Tom Brady was, at the time, the New England Patriots' active starting quarterback and among the most recognizable figures in American sports. Having him voice himself in an episode that both celebrated and gently satirized the Patriots organization gave the episode a particular energy that depended on Brady's willingness to participate in the joke at his own expense. 7 months after Patriot games aired, Peter Griffin became a police officer for the first time. The circumstances in Barely Legal, the 8th episode of the 5th season, had the particular Family Guy quality of being both absurd and internally logical. Mayor Adam West had been watching the film Romancing the Stone, and apparently did not understand that it was a film. He deployed the entire Quahog Police Department to Cartagena, Colombia, to search for a character named Elaine, who had been kidnapped in the story. The deployment was citywide and immediate. The one officer not sent to Colombia was Joe Swanson, left behind because, as the reasoning went, parts of South America were not wheelchair accessible. Joe was the acting representative of the Quahog Police Department, alone, in a city that had just been stripped of its entire force on the instruction of its mayor. Peter, Cleveland, and Quagmire volunteered to help. They joined the department as auxiliary officers, reported for training, and entered an experience they had each imagined to be considerably more kinetic than it turned out to be. Peter's primary desire, stated clearly in the episode, was to shoot someone. This was not a fringe ambition expressed in a moment of poor judgment. It was his stated professional goal as a police officer. He wanted the opportunity to discharge a weapon at a person. Police work, as Peter discovered almost immediately, is filled with hours that do not provide this opportunity. The actual work of running a police department on a skeleton crew involves documentation, non-emergency calls, and situations that resolve through conversation rather than gunfire. The Police Academy film series hovered over the episode as an explicit reference. Peter characterized their first day at the station as his first day at Police Academy 4, which was the entry in that franchise where ordinary civilians were brought in to serve as officers. Quagmire showed up wearing a shirt that referenced Mahoney, one of that franchise's central characters. The show was using a familiar cultural shorthand to describe what Peter and his friends had imagined police work to look like, while the actual experience inside the episode consistently failed to match that image. A piece of physical comedy arrived when coffee at the station turned out to have been laced with PCP, and various characters experienced the drug's effects differently. Quagmire ripped off a section of his own skin while in conversation, noting that he could not feel it, which was itself a clinical description of one of PCP's anesthetic effects. The show handled this with the same tone it handles most of its more specific medical humor, accurately enough that the accuracy was part of the joke. The action they had been waiting for finally materialized when Chris let slip that Meg had taken Brian. She had knocked him unconscious with a bag of dog food, driven him to a hotel, and bound him to a chair with a plan that the show staged and handled with the tone it typically applies to extreme situations involving Meg. Peter, Cleveland, and Quagmire were the ones who raided the hotel room and extracted Brian from the situation. Cleveland announced their arrival by telling Meg not to move, in language borrowed directly from the Police Academy films. Quagmire delivered the episode's most unexpected beat. Dressed in a leopard print swimsuit, he sat with Meg and gave her a calm and genuine talk about her self-worth and why she did not need a boyfriend at that moment. The scene did not play as a joke. It played as something unusually sincere for a character the show usually kept firmly in comedic territory. What Barely Legal reveals about Peter as a police officer is the same thing Patriot Games revealed about Peter as a football player. He is drawn to the version of a role that exists in his imagination, and is consistently surprised by the version that exists in practice. The football player Peter imagined was someone who got to do whatever he wanted after scoring, including theatrical musical performances. The police officer Peter imagined was someone who got to shoot people regularly. Neither imagination aligned with the actual professional context. In both cases, Peter was genuine in his enthusiasm and genuine in his disappointment. 10 years and several seasons later, Peter became a police officer again, this time without the backdrop of a city-wide crisis. The 15th season episode, Cop and a Half-Wit, which aired in March 2017, found Joe in a situation that was a different kind of crisis. He had been sidelined within the department and was spending his days caring for a gerbil rather than working cases. The institutional erosion of a career that had been built on real capability and commitment was something the episode took seriously underneath its comedic surface. Peter got involved because his car broke down, and Joe gave him a ride. A call came in on the police radio about drug activity in Quahog. Joe, following procedure, wanted to wait for backup. Peter, following his own internal logic, borrowed a gun from somewhere and charged into the building to confront the situation directly. The crooks were apprehended. When Joe was called to his superior's office, expecting consequences, he was instead praised for cracking the case. The credit went to Joe because Joe was the police officer. Peter was a neighbor who had charged into a drug operation with a borrowed firearm. The partnership that followed was productive in the narrow sense that crimes were solved. Peter functioned as the physical presence willing to do things the institutional framework of the department would not formally authorize. Joe functioned as the credentialed officer who received the recognition afterward. The problem was that Peter saw every news broadcast, every commendation, every public acknowledgement of Joe's work, and noticed the absence of his own name in all of it. Blackmail was his next step. Peter approached Joe and stated his position. Silence about Peter's involvement would cost Joe access to items from the evidence locker. Peter specifically wanted a Discman that had belonged to a murdered jogger, on the theory that the evidence locker contained one and that he wanted it. Joe, caught between the professional reality of what Peter had done and the legal reality of what Peter was now proposing, paid the price. The Discman changed hands. The partnership continued under new terms. Joe's decision to come clean resolved the dynamic before it could reach the point of institutional damage. He wanted to tell the truth about how the cases had been solved and who had actually done what. Before he could, the episode's final crime arrived: a robbery at the Quahog Mini-Mart. Peter, attempting to reach a state of psychological readiness, rubbed a topical decongestant on his body in an area that caused him immediate and significant eye irritation. He was effectively neutralized by his own preparation. What happened at the Mini-Mart without Peter's functional contribution was Joe Swanson handling the situation alone, with the force and competence and confidence that had defined his career before institutional erosion had worn it down. He kicked the door. He confronted the suspects. He resolved the situation through the specific combination of authority and physical commitment that Joe, at his best, was capable of. Peter told him afterward that he had always had it in him, and that Peter had simply been an insufferable enough partner to push it back to the surface. Joe agreed that Peter was a real pain, but acknowledged that something had come back. They parted on those terms. 3 episodes across 3 separate seasons: a football player, an auxiliary cop, and an unofficial detective. And across all of them, the same structural truth. Peter, in a uniform, performs the version of the role that his imagination constructed in advance, collides eventually with the version the institution actually needed, and ends the job having discovered something real about the gap between the two. With Tom Brady, the gap was between a player and a performer. With Joe Swanson, the gap was between what Peter wanted credit for and what credit was actually going to accomplish. The uniform arrived. The expectation arrived with it. Peter met neither cleanly and managed to be genuinely useful in the collision. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Patriots uniform lasted until the Shipoopi performance ended it. The police badge came and went twice. Next, a look at some of the smallest jobs on Peter's resume, the ones that lasted a single scene, a single day, or, occasionally, a single sentence, and what the accumulated weight of them says about the man who held every one. Section 9. The short ones. Richard Dreyfuss, attending a school play at Stewie's elementary school, is what started Peter's career as a paparazzo. Kevin Federline once employed him as a magic mirror. Sandy Duncan had him installed as her glass eye. Lara Flynn Boyle needed him as a source of nighttime heat. These are among the shorter entries on Peter Griffin's professional record, positions that lasted one scene or one afternoon, or the length of a single cutaway gag, and which sit beside the major chapters of his employment history as proof of a man who kept ending up in situations that no resume template was designed to accommodate. Stewie's school play was the one that started the paparazzo chapter. The 8th season episode, Peterassment, began with Peter and Lois attending a theatrical production at Stewie's school, which turned out to be a musical adaptation of the Terry Schiavo case. Stewie played the plug to Terry's life support, which is the kind of casting decision that only happens in a school where the administration has made some choices. Peter arrived with a camera to document the performance and found himself capturing something more commercially interesting. Richard Dreyfuss, who was seated in the audience watching a nephew perform, and who was unaware he was being filmed. Peter sold the footage to a local television station. He got paid for it, and he decided that this was something he should be doing professionally. The transition from one accidental celebrity sighting to a declared career as a paparazzo required the specific brand of Peter reasoning that treats any outcome as a confirming signal. He had filmed someone without their knowledge, sold it, received money. The logical next step, from Peter's perspective, was to do that continuously as a professional activity on the streets of Quahog. He acquired a camera. He began locating celebrities and filming them. Tom Tucker and Mayor Adam West were among his subjects. Both were Quahog figures rather than nationally prominent celebrities, which tells you something about the scale of the paparazzi market Peter was operating in. Quahog's entertainment press was a limited ecosystem, and Peter was staking out the neighborhood anchors and local officials rather than genuinely famous people. The professional ambition was present even if the geography confined it. He was going to be a paparazzo. The definition of a celebrity worth following would have to flex accordingly. The career ended at Ollie Williams. Williams was the Quahog 5 News weatherman, a man whose segments had always been brief by design and whose patience for being filmed without consent turned out to be essentially non-existent. When Peter pointed the camera at him, Ollie responded by punching it. The punch broke both the camera lens and Peter's glasses simultaneously. The paparazzo business required a camera that functioned, and Peter's was now destroyed. The professional chapter was over in a single moment of Ollie Williams refusing to be footage. What the paparazzo stint reveals is the same thing the news segment revealed a few seasons earlier. Peter has a genuine understanding that celebrity is a market, that attention is a resource, and that someone who can successfully capture or deliver either of those things can get paid. Both jobs placed him adjacent to the media infrastructure of Quahog's public life. Both ended quickly. The news segment ended because a drunk driving incident gave Tom Tucker a comeback story. The paparazzo career ended because Ollie Williams punched his glasses off. The mechanism was different. The shape of the outcome was the same. The AA sponsor chapter came out of an entirely different kind of professional experience. In the 9th season episode, Friends of Peter G., Peter and Brian were ordered to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings after causing a public disturbance while drunk at a movie theater. The specific nature of the disturbance placed them in enough trouble that a judge decided the 12-step process was the appropriate intervention. Neither of them was particularly willing to engage with the program's central premise, which required acknowledging that a problem existed. Peter's resistance to that acknowledgement was what brought Death into the episode. Death, who had been an occasional character in Family Guy since the show's earliest seasons, appeared to Peter after a car crash that occurred while Peter was driving home drunk. Rather than simply collecting Peter, Death offered a demonstration. He showed Peter two possible versions of his life, one in which the drinking continued at its current trajectory, and one in which it never happened at all. The version with heavy drinking was not subtle in its depictions. That Peter was abusive to his family, mean in ways his usual self was not, and had at some point ended up in an affair with Angela, his brewery supervisor. The show staged the Angela revelation as the most horrifying detail in a vision designed to be horrifying, and Peter's response to discovering he had slept with Angela in a drunk future was genuinely alarmed. The version without any drinking was a different kind of problem. That Peter was a complete bore, quiet, careful, cautious, entirely without the energy that made his actual life recognizable. He had optimized away everything that was Peter Griffin and produced someone nobody at the Drunken Clam would particularly want to spend time with. Death's conclusion was neither extreme. The key, he told Peter, was moderation, not abstinence, not continuation at the current pace, a middle path between the two futures he had been shown. Peter absorbed this and made a practical decision. He purchased his usual quantity of beer and threw half of it away, on the theory that half the beer was half the drinking, and that half the drinking was moderation. The math was Peter-specific and almost certainly not what the AA program had in mind. But it was sincere in a way that Peter's decisions are often sincere. He was trying to apply what he had learned with the tools available to him. The episode's connection to his brief stint as an AA sponsor is one of the stranger entries in his working life. The program that had initially been imposed on him as a consequence became, briefly, a space where he had some kind of role in guiding others through it. Peter Griffin as a sponsor in a sobriety program is an image that requires a certain amount of imaginative generosity to hold. But Family Guy has never been particularly interested in letting the implausibility of a premise stop it from exploring where the premise goes. What the AA experience adds to the record of Peter's working life is something none of the other jobs can quite provide. A moment when the occupation was entirely about the self. Most jobs ask a person to do something for someone else. The AA process asks a person to do something with themselves and then potentially become useful to others trying to do the same thing. Peter's engagement with it was imperfect and mediated by Death's intervention rather than by any internal reckoning. But the outcome, the moderation framework, and the discarded beer was genuinely his own response to something the show treated with more weight than its setup suggested. Scattered across the show's run are jobs that lasted shorter than any of these. Sandy Duncan's glass eye is one of the more frequently referenced. In a cutaway from the Jungle Love episode, while Peter was working at the brewery and had not yet been there long, he mentioned having previously worked as the glass eye of the actress Sandy Duncan. The joke operated on the specific register of the absurd that Family Guy's cutaway format enabled. A job that could not literally exist, delivered with complete commitment. Peter had been Sandy Duncan's glass eye. He had been inside her eye socket. He had recommendations about breakfast cereal based on the experience. Kevin Federline's magic mirror is another. In the same episode, a cutaway depicted Peter as the literal magical mirror from Snow White, employed by Kevin Federline to answer questions about how Federline could look like a douchebag. Peter advised him, "Do not shave, do not shower, keep wearing the tank top he had slept in, and walk around with an undeserved sense of accomplishment." The joke worked on two levels. It was funny because Peter was a mirror, and it was funnier because Peter's advice was genuinely specific and genuinely what Federline appeared to be doing. Lara Flynn Boyle's nighttime heat is listed among Peter's jobs in the show's recorded lore, which places him in the role of a piece of furniture or ambient warmth rather than an employee in any conventional sense. The category of jobs Peter has held that are technically inanimate objects is one that most resumes do not include. Family Guy's use of the cutaway format created a space where these entries could exist alongside the brewery and the fishing boat without disrupting the logic of the show. Because the cutaway is explicitly outside that logic, it is the show stepping aside from the story to say, "Here is another thing which may or may not have happened, which tells you something about who this man is." The firefighter appearances came in real episodes rather than cutaways across several seasons. Peter put on the gear, took on the role with the same commitment he brings to all roles, and was involved in fire-related situations in ways that the firefighter title suggests and the details sometimes complicated. The bartender stretches at the Drunken Clam arrived when circumstances at the bar required someone to be behind the counter, and Peter was the person who was there. Both of these were situational rather than career choices, the kind of job a person ends up doing because the position needed filling and they were available. Doctor is a category that appears on the list twice, with the episodes Stewie Loves Lois and Papa Has a Rollin' Son. The Stewie Loves Lois episode is notable for a different reason in the show's history. It involved a prostate exam scene that Stewie interpreted as sexual assault, which is where most discussion of the episode focuses. But the doctor element places Peter briefly in a medical context he was not trained for. The second appearance reinforced the same idea. Peter in a doctor role, operating without credentials, in a situation that required both. The accumulated weight of the short ones, taken together, produces a profile that the major jobs alone cannot. The toy factory and the brewery tell the story of Peter's working life in the way that a main character arc tells a story, with cause and effect, with time to develop, with consequences that carry forward. The short ones tell a different kind of story. They tell it in the way that a collection of artifacts tells a story, not through sequence, but through accumulation. A glass eye, a magic mirror, a night as Lara Flynn Boyle's ambient warmth, a paparazzo camera that lasted until Ollie Williams ended it, a sponsor role in a program that began as a legal mandate and produced a philosophy of throwing away half your beer. None of these jobs changed Peter's life. None of them lasted long enough to do that. What they changed, collectively, is the picture of who Peter is. A man who can land in any of these positions and approach each one with the same fundamental orientation, enthusiasm, sincerity, and a near total absence of doubt about whether he belongs there, is a man whose relationship to work is not defined by what he is good at or what he was trained for. It is defined by what he is willing to show up as. Peter Griffin has been willing to show up as almost anything. He has done it across almost 3 decades of television. He has been a paparazzo, and a mirror, and a glass eye, and a meth dealer, and a pirate, and a president, and a shipping clerk. And he has brought the same essential person to each of those roles. The jobs change. He does not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The small jobs fill in the spaces between the major ones, and between all of them, They produce a picture of a man who has never once asked whether a role was appropriate for him before taking it. The final section closes the account, and the one angle of Peter's working life that none of the previous 9 sections has fully addressed. Section 10. What Peter Wanted. In the 14th season episode, Peter, Chris, and Brian, adult Peter sat down and watched a video he had recorded to himself as a teenager. Teenage Peter came on screen and announced that he hoped his future self was a big, important doctor like Doogie Howser. Before signing off, he said he just hoped to God he was not stuck in some loser job. And then he listed 3 specific examples: a brewery, a toy factory, a fishing boat. He was confident none of those outcomes would materialize. The adult man watching the tape had spent 3 seasons as a safety inspector at a toy factory, had owned and lost a fishing boat in a hurricane, and was currently employed in the shipping department of a brewery in Quahog. Teenage Peter's confidence was total. He had a future mapped out for himself: doctor, success, the opposite of dead-end employment. And he recorded it with the self-assurance of someone who could not yet see the gap between what a person plans and what a person becomes. The tape ended. Adult Peter sat in the room with it. The joke was not subtle and did not need to be. The adult man watching the tape had worked at a toy factory, had been a fisherman on a boat, and was currently employed at a brewery. He had hit every target on the list of jobs teenage Peter hoped to miss. He had become, precisely, what teenage Peter feared. He listed those 3 jobs specifically: brewery, toy factory, fishing boat, because those were the 3 major employment chapters that had defined his working life up to the episode's point. They were the ones that had lasted seasons, that had given him an identity for stretches of time, that had structured the years and decades of his adult life. They were the visible architecture of the resume, the headline entries that any accountant of Peter Griffin's career would cite first. And teenage Peter had flagged all 3 of them as evidence of a life that had not gone according to plan. Adult Peter, watching the tape, called himself out quietly. He said he had never done anything important. He felt the recognition that the man he was and the man he had imagined himself becoming were not the same person. The show did not turn this into an extended meditation. It moved on, as it always does, but the moment stayed in the episode because it was true in a way that most of Family Guy's self-referential humor is not quite. Peter had not become what he hoped to become. The jobs he ended up with were not the jobs he had envisioned. That video contains a joke that points at something the show had already confirmed more directly 2 seasons earlier. In the 12th season episode, Meg Stinks, Peter and Meg shared a late-night diner conversation that became one of the quieter and more genuinely affecting moments in the show's long history. Meg had been asking why Peter seemed to resent her existence. Peter's answer was not cruelty. It was honesty of a specific kind. He told her that he had been dating Lois, that he had not liked wearing condoms, and that as a result, he had ended up with a mortgage, children, and a job at a toy factory. He did not frame this as anyone's fault. He was describing a sequence of events that had produced a life he had not designed. Meg's response was to ask whether he had not liked his job at the toy factory. Peter's answer was absolute. Hell no. He always wanted to be a podiatrist. The cutaway that followed showed him at a podiatry practice, in a white coat, examining a patient's feet. The joke was brief. Then it stepped outside itself. A voice said directly that this was not a joke. He really did want to be a podiatrist. The cutaway returned to the diner. The scene continued. Podiatry is a specific choice. It is not glamorous. It does not carry the cultural weight of surgery or emergency medicine. A podiatrist treats conditions of the feet, works regular hours, occupies a quiet corner of the healthcare system. It is a decent profession, a stable one, something a person could build an ordinary and comfortable life around. It is exactly the kind of aspiration that makes sense for a young man from Peter's background with Peter's disposition. Not too ambitious, not too flashy, just a specific thing done competently for the people who needed it. What Peter wanted, it turned out, was something small and specific and achievable. He did not want to be famous. He did not want to found a nation or run a corporation or play professional football. Those things happened to him. What he wanted, before condoms and mortgages and toy factories, was to be a foot doctor in a modest practice somewhere in Rhode Island. The show delivered this information without ceremony, tagged it as sincere, and moved on. But it is the most clarifying piece of information in the show's entire accounting of Peter Griffin's working life. Everything else was consequence. Podiatry was the dream. Alongside the visible job history, the factory, the boat, the brewery, the dozens of shorter positions, there is an entry that the show has maintained quietly in the background of Peter's working life since the 4th season. The National Association for the Advancement of Fat People, known by its initials, is an organization Peter founded in the episode The Fat Guy Strangler, after a routine physical confirmed what his clothes had been suggesting for years. A doctor told him he was overweight and needed to make lifestyle changes. Peter's response was not to make lifestyle changes. His response was to found an advocacy organization. The NAAFP was established with a mission to promote the social and economic equality of fat people and to address discrimination on the basis of weight. The real organization it parodied was the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which had been one of the central institutions of the American Civil Rights Movement. Peter took the acronym, replaced one word, and created a structure designed to serve his own interests while adopting the formal language of civil rights advocacy. The membership was male only, as Peter specified that fat women were not admitted. The only identified members were named Victor and Todd. Meetings were held at the Griffin household. Snacks were always brought. The flatulence produced by a room full of very large men eating constantly was loud enough that nothing said at the meetings could be heard. Several members were killed by Patrick Pewterschmidt, Lois's mentally ill brother, who was targeting overweight men across Quahog in episodes that established him as the Fat Guy Strangler. The NAAFP lost members to serial murder. The organization held a funeral for at least one of them, at which the group's anthem was performed for the first time. In the episode Bread Losers, during an unemployment period, Peter used the NAAFP as an economic vehicle. He encouraged fat positivity across Quahog, attracted a large number of new members, and extracted income from the expanded group during the period when he needed it. The organization had become, briefly, a revenue source. Whether this constitutes a legitimate use of a civil rights organization is a question the show declined to address. Peter needed money, and the NAAFP had members. The connection between those two facts was one he was willing to exploit. The NAAFP has a longer continuous existence in Peter's employment history than almost anything else. The brewery is the longest unbroken professional relationship, but the NAAFP was founded in Season 4 and continued running in the background through subsequent seasons in a way that no other of Peter's vocational projects managed. It sits in the unusual category of a job Peter created for himself that he never quite lost, never quite quit, and never quite had taken from him. The serial murderer killed some of the members. The organization endured. Placing Peter's employment history in the tradition of the American working-class sitcom reveals how deliberately the show was constructed around that tradition from the beginning. Family Guy's DNA includes the Honeymooners, which established the template in the 1950s. A working-class man in New York, financial strain running through every episode. The gap between what the man thinks he deserves and what his circumstances provide. The show made this connection explicit. In the Mr. Saturday Night episode, after Peter failed to find a new job following the toy factory's closure and decided to try the Renaissance Fair instead, Lois made a direct reference to the Honeymooners episode where Ralph Cramden lost his job and did not get it back by the end of the episode. Peter said he remembered it, and it had bothered him. The show was acknowledging its lineage while placing itself inside it. Ralph Cramden drove a bus. He yelled about schemes. He loved his wife in a particular blustering, undemonstrative way. The gap between his self-image and his station in life was the source of most of the comedy. Ed Norton worked in the sewers below New York and was probably more content with his life than Ralph was with his. The show understood that the working-class patriarch's relationship to work was defined more by aspiration than by the work itself. All in the Family built on that template a generation later, with Archie Bunker in Queens, loading docks replaced by a living room armchair. The frustrations of a man watching a world change around him in ways he could not control. The Simpsons arrived in 1989 and placed Homer Simpson at the Springfield nuclear power plant, a safety inspector who was genuinely terrible at his job. Surrounded by a boss who barely acknowledged his existence, in a marriage and family that was too large and expensive for his income. Seth MacFarlane's debt to The Simpsons has been discussed at length across the show's history, and the Peter-Homer comparison is one that both shows have addressed directly. In the Simpsons Guy crossover episode, the two characters argued about their beers and wound up in a fight that lasted through the episode. Both shows knew what they shared. What separates Peter's working life from Homer's is primarily volume and variety. Homer works at the plant, with occasional departures. Peter has had 3 major employers across the show's run and dozens of supporting positions. The toy factory gave way to the fishing boat, which gave way to the brewery, which has been the home base ever since. Around the brewery, Peter has been a football player and a policeman and a pirate and a meth dealer, and a restaurant owner, and a paparazzo, and a president. Homer has been a food critic, and a farmer, and a carny, but his employment history does not approach the accumulation of Peter's. Quahog was built as a place that could absorb all of these experiences. Seth MacFarlane had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and modeled the city after Providence, a mid-sized New England city with a specific economic character. Post-industrial, working-class in significant areas, home to a university and a functioning port, surrounded by a state with a history of manufacturing and maritime industry. The toy factory, the fishing boat, and the brewery are all Rhode Island-appropriate employers. A man of Peter's background and position in that economy would plausibly cycle through those kinds of jobs. The show built an economy first and put Peter inside it, rather than building Peter and then finding him an economy to live in. Manufacturing in New England declined substantially across the decades in which Family Guy has been running. The toy factory's closure at the end of Season 3 arrived in 2001, at a moment when American manufacturing employment was in a long-term contraction. The happy-go-lucky toy factory was demolished not because of economic forces, but because Mr. Weed choked on a dinner roll, which is the show's particular way of handling things. But the factory closing and Peter moving to the water economy and then eventually to service work at a brewery tracks a real pattern in the region's labor history. Whether intentional or not, Peter's major employment arc follows a version of what happened to millions of actual workers in the same geographic and economic space. The brewery survived what the factory could not. Pawtucket Patriot Ale is a regional beer brand in a market that, by the mid-2000s, was expanding rather than contracting. The craft and regional brewing industry grew throughout the period when Family Guy was placing Peter at the brewery's shipping desk. His job there has survived the legal threat from Duff Beer, the Simpsons Guy lawsuit that went all the way to Fred Flintstone as judge, and was resolved only because the Simpsons characters decided not to travel to Quahog to enforce the verdict. It has survived multiple firings and a lottery win that prompted Peter to quit and leave a pile of excrement on Angela's desk. It survived Angela's death and the transition to Bert and Sheila. The brewery is the institution in Peter's working life that has absorbed everything and continued operating. There is a quality to the jobs Peter ends up keeping that distinguishes them from the ones he loses. The brewery tolerates him in a way the toy factory tolerated him, repeatedly, with exasperation, but consistently. The difference is structural. At the toy factory, a death ended the position completely, and Peter's record there was genuinely catastrophic. 3 firings, multiple threats of termination, a congressional lobbying assignment given to him by the tobacco company that bought the factory, a history of letting dangerous toys reach children. The brewery has absorbed all of Peter's equivalent disasters without closing. It keeps Peter because the institution is durable enough to survive him. Work, for Peter Griffin, has never been the thing he defines himself by. The jobs have been the context in which his life happened, not the engine of it. He went to the toy factory because he needed money. He went fishing because the factory closed and he needed money. He went to the brewery because the boat sank and he needed money. The entrepreneurial ventures, the power grabs, the one-episode roles, all of them arrived as opportunities or circumstances, not as career decisions. The one time the show asked Peter what he actually wanted from professional life, in a diner at 1 in the morning with a daughter who was trying to understand why her father seemed unhappy, the answer was podiatry. A modest practice, regular hours, someone else's feet. The resume closes, as all working lives eventually do, not with a conclusion, but with a current position. Peter Griffin works in the shipping department of the Pawtucket Brewery. He has worked there since Jungle Love in September 2005. He has worked there longer than he worked at the toy factory, longer than he was a fisherman, longer than he was a football player, or a pirate, or a president, or a meth dealer. The brewery is where the arc of his employment came to rest, not because he chose it, but because the sequence of everything that came before it pointed him there, and the brewery, unlike everything else, did not send him away for good. Teenage Peter had hoped for something else. He had recorded a message to his future self that assumed the future would look better than the present. He was wrong in the specific way that aspirations are often wrong, not catastrophically, but quietly, in the distance between what was planned and what arrived. The podiatrist never happened. The brewery did. The resume that exists between those two facts, every toy and boat and fish and beer and law enforcement badge and pirate parrot and farm and meth lab and football uniform and country with a name and corporation with a board and news segment and glass eye and magic mirror is the record of a man who kept showing up to whatever came next for more than 25 years without ever quite finding his way to the feet. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.